You really think you can fix these 17 dead cars? They belong in a junkyard, just like your career. Good luck with that.
He spent every dollar he had on 17 wrecked cars, and the entire room laughed at him. But she laughed the loudest. She was worth $4 billion, owned 43 dealerships across 8 states, and had never once been wrong about a car in her life. So when a quiet man in a faded flannel shirt signed papers for a pile of rusted-out junk that most scrapyards would have turned away, Vanessa Sinclair didn't just shake her head. She made sure the cameras caught her doing it. What she didn't know, what nobody in that warehouse knew, was that one of those rusted hulks was about to bring her entire empire to its knees. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The smell hit Mason Ryder the moment he stepped through the side door of the Hargrove Industrial Warehouse. Motor oil soaked so deep into the concrete it had become part of the floor, rust particles hanging in the cold morning air like something the building itself was exhaling. And underneath it all, the faint ghost of gasoline. Some people would have found that combination oppressive. Mason breathed it in like it was the first clean air he'd had in months. It was February, and the warehouse sat on the industrial edge of a mid-sized town called Kellerton, about 38 miles southwest of Detroit. The kind of town that had once been something, a Ford supplier plant here, a stamping facility there, and now mostly existed in the memory of older men who talked about it too much at diners. The Hargrove building itself had been a parts distribution center in another life. Now twice a year it hosted salvage auctions, and serious collectors knew to show up early. Mason showed up an hour before the doors opened. He stood in the parking lot in the dark with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the light inside the warehouse glow pale yellow through the high windows. And he counted his breathing the way his daughter had taught him. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out. Lily had learned it from a YouTube video about anxiety when she was 9 years old, and she'd been trying to get him to use it ever since. He hadn't told her he had been practicing it in secret for 3 weeks. He was 32. He had $3,200 in a savings account that had taken 11 months to build. He had a 7-year-old daughter who believed he could fix anything with enough time and the right wrench. He had a 98 GMC Sierra with 214,000 miles on it that had been making a sound he didn't want to think about when he pushed past 60 on the highway. And he had a plan so specific and so risky that he hadn't told another living soul about it. When the doors opened and the crowd filtered in, Mason walked slowly down the row of vehicles laid out in the center of the warehouse floor. 17 cars total, all flagged for the morning lot, all of them damaged, most of them badly. He didn't pull out his phone to look things up. He moved the way his father had taught him, slowly, hands in pockets, head slightly tilted, like the cars were telling him something and he was trying not to interrupt. He stopped at a crushed '68 Camaro with the roof caved in on the driver's side, crouched down, looked at the frame rails, the floor pans, the original data plate barely visible behind the firewall, stood up, moved on. He stopped again at something that looked at first glance like a burned-out station wagon from the 70s. The entire exterior was scorched. The front end looked like someone had driven it into a wall and then set it on fire. But Mason stood there for almost 4 full minutes before he moved on, and a tiny muscle near his jaw did something that wasn't quite a smile. No one in the room noticed him, which was fine. That was fine. Pasek. The crowd that morning was maybe 60 people. Dealers, collectors, a few curiosity seekers who'd seen the auction listing online. The energy in the place was casual, even a little dismissive. Most of the serious collectors had already written off this particular lot. Word had gotten around that the vehicles came from a seized storage facility, and the preliminary listings weren't promising. What passed for a catalog was a single laminated sheet at the registration table with vehicle make, model year if known, and condition noted as either fair, poor, or extensive damage. Every single vehicle on that sheet was listed as extensive damage. A man named Roy Pittman, who ran a small classic car dealership out of a converted barn in rural Michigan, found Mason standing near the back of the lot and walked over. "You thinking about bidding on any of this?" Roy asked. He said it the way you'd ask someone if they were actually going to eat the cafeteria food. "Maybe a few," Mason said. Roy looked at him, then at the row of wrecked cars, then back at him. "Which ones?" "Haven't decided yet." Roy squinted. He'd known Mason casually for about 2 years, from regional swap meets and a couple of local shows. He knew Mason was good with his hands, knew he'd been trying to get a restoration business off the ground since his wife left, and he'd moved back to Kellerton to be closer to his dad's old contacts. He liked Mason fine, but he also knew the difference between a man with a plan and a man with a feeling. "Some of these don't have titles," Roy said carefully. "I know. You know about the 72 Chevelle they were advertising? The one that was the headliner for this lot? It got pulled last week. Private sale." Roy blinked. "How do you know that?" Mason just looked at him. Roy shrugged it off. "Well, good luck." He drifted back toward the main floor, and Mason turned his attention to a tarp-covered shape in the far corner of the lot that nobody else seemed to be paying attention to. It was separated from the other vehicles by maybe 10 feet of open floor, and the tarp covering it was a different color than the others, older, sun-faded green instead of the standard blue tarps on the rest of the lot. He stood in front of it for a while. He didn't lift the tarp. He just looked at the shape underneath it. The silhouette, the approximate length, the height at the front end versus the rear. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and looked at a page he'd already read maybe 60 times. Then he put it away. The thing about Vanessa Sinclair was that she didn't usually attend these kinds of auctions. She had people for that. Her purchasing division included 6 full-time buyers, 2 of whom had advanced degrees in automotive history, and 1 of whom had previously worked for Barrett Jackson. When Sinclair Automotive Group wanted to acquire vehicles for their corporate collection or for promotional purposes, those people handled it. They sent reports. She reviewed them. That was the system. But she was in Kellerton that morning for a different reason. A meeting with a regional bank executive about refinancing terms on 3 dealerships she was expanding. And her assistant Marcus had mentioned the Hargrove auction almost as an aside. "It's on your way if you wanted to stop." He'd said it the way you mention a garage sale when you're already driving past it. She'd said she'd think about it, which usually meant no, but she stopped. She was 30 years old, which surprised people when they met her in person. They expected someone older, or at least someone who looked like they'd been worn down by the work of building a $4 billion business. And instead, they got a woman who looked like she could have been a graduate student. Slim, composed, dark hair pulled back with the specific kind of carelessness that actually takes effort. She dressed the way people dress when they've stopped trying to prove things with clothes and have moved on to proving them with everything else. She walked into the warehouse with Marcus and a woman named Delia from her legal team, who was there for unrelated reasons and had just been in the car. Vanessa moved through the lot with the brisk efficiency of someone who had already decided she wasn't buying anything, but was going to assess the situation anyway, because assessing situations was simply what she did. She glanced at a destroyed Mustang, said nothing, looked at the crushed Camaro, shook her head slightly, kept moving. She was nearly back to the entrance when she noticed the man in the flannel jacket standing near the registration table, signing something. She noticed him because of the precision of it. He wasn't filling out the registration casually the way most bidders did. He was reading every line, slowly, like each word mattered. She also noticed, vaguely, that he looked like he'd driven here in whatever truck was parked crookedly out front with the cracked taillight. She looked at Marcus. "What's the opening bid on the lot as a whole?" "They're doing it individually this time." "Why?" The estate that owned the storage facility specified individual sales in the liquidation order, something about insurance assessments. Vanessa filed that away. "Who's the estate?" Marcus checked his tablet. "A restoration engineer named Gerald Ryder, deceased. The storage facility was in his name. The vehicles were seized after about 8 months of unpaid fees." Vanessa had never heard the name Gerald Ryder. She would spend a lot of time, later, thinking about the fact that she had never heard the name Gerald Ryder. The auction started at 10. The auctioneer was a compact, energetic man named Dale, who had the gift of making everything sound more exciting than it was, which was useful in a room full of extensively damaged vehicles. He moved through the first 4 cars quickly. 2 went for scrap value. 1, a 78 Trans Am with a destroyed interior but a solid body, got a modest bidding war going before a dealer from Flint took it for $4,200. Mason stood near the middle of the crowd and bid on nothing for the first 15 minutes. Roy Pittman, watching from nearby, noticed this and tried to catch Mason's eye. Mason didn't look over. The fifth vehicle was a 1969 Dodge Charger with front-end damage so severe that half the hood had been replaced with raw sheet metal from something that was clearly a different vehicle entirely. Dale described it with heroic optimism. The room responded with murmurs that were mostly skeptical. Mason raised his number. He took it for $1,100. Low enough that a few people looked at him, high enough that nobody else bothered to compete. Roy walked over. "What are you doing?" "Bidding," Mason said. "That Charger is—" "I know what it is." Roy studied the side of Mason's face for a moment. "Do you actually know something I don't?" "Yeah," Mason said simply. Roy waited, but nothing else came. He went back to his spot. Over the next 40 minutes, Mason bid on 7 more vehicles. He lost 2 of them. A '66 Chevelle he let go at $3,800, which was exactly the number where the math stopped working, and a destroyed pickup he hadn't actually wanted but had tested the room with. He won 5, all of them at prices that ranged from insulting to merely low. The room was starting to pay attention to him now, not with respect exactly, but with the particular curiosity reserved for someone doing something confusing. Vanessa was still in the building. She hadn't meant to stay this long. She was standing near the side wall with her arms crossed and her phone in her hand, half reading emails, and something about the rhythm of the quiet man's bidding had started pulling at her attention in an irritating way. She leaned toward Marcus and said quietly, "Who is that?" Marcus looked. "The bidder? Don't know." "Find out." It was when vehicle number 14 came up that things changed in the room. It was the burned station wagon, a 1971 AMC Ambassador, the listing said, though the tarp had been hiding the worst of it from casual inspection, and when Dale pulled the cover off, the genuine extent of the damage went through the crowd like a cold draft. The entire driver's side was collapsed. The roof had been cut at some point. Fire department, probably. The scorching extended from the front bumper all the way to the C-pillar on both sides. Several people in the room actually laughed when Dale started his opening description. "Now, folks, I want you to keep an open mind." More laughter. "Because what we have here is a genuine 1971 Ambassador, which, for the enthusiasts in the room, it's a paperweight," someone called out, and the room appreciated that. Dale kept his professional smile. "Opening at $300, folks. $300. Mason raised his number. $350? Do I have $350? Mason held his number up again. "Son, you're bidding against yourself," Dale said, and this got a real laugh, a good one, the kind that filled the warehouse and bounced off the metal roof. Mason put his number down. $400, he said. His voice was flat and even and carried clearly through the room. $400, thank you. Do I have $450? Silence. $400 going once? $400 going twice. Dale's gavel came down. Sold to bidder. He checked the number. 47 for $400. Vanessa, who had been watching this without fully meaning to, said something to herself that she didn't say out loud. She said it to herself, but her expression said enough. And a man standing nearby with a camera, a local automotive blogger who covered salvage auctions for a small YouTube channel, caught about 4 seconds of it on video. She looked at the wreck of the Ambassador. She looked at the man who'd just bought it. She said audibly enough for the 2 people next to her, "What on earth is he going to do with that? It's worth more as scrap metal." The man with the camera kept filming. The last 3 vehicles went quickly. Mason took 2 of them, a '70 Plymouth Barracuda with a destroyed nose and no engine, and a '67 Pontiac GTO that had apparently been in an extremely creative accident involving what looked, based on the damage pattern, like a telephone pole and possibly a fence. He let the last vehicle, a nondescript late '70s pickup, go without bidding. Final tally. Mason Ryder, bidder 47, had purchased 9 vehicles. The total when the paperwork was added up at the registration table came to $2,740. He'd budgeted $2,500. He'd have to move some money around. He stood at the table and signed each form carefully, the same way Vanessa had noticed at the beginning of the auction. He wrote slowly but without hesitation, not the writing of someone unsure of what they're doing, but of someone for whom each signature meant something specific. Roy Pittman came over as Mason was finishing. 9 cars, Roy said. 9 cars. Mason. Roy dropped his voice. He wasn't cruel, Roy. He was genuinely trying to be a friend. "What are you doing, man? Your truck barely made it here. You've got Lily. You can't—" "I know what I'm doing, Roy. That ambassador is going to cost you more to tow than you paid for it." "I know." Roy looked at him for a long moment. He was about to say something else, something more direct, when there was a small commotion near the entrance of the warehouse. Not loud exactly, but the kind of movement that makes a room shift its attention the way a school of fish will all turn at once. Vanessa Sinclair was standing about 20 feet from the registration table, and she had apparently decided to say what she'd been thinking. "Excuse me," she said. It wasn't a question. She had the kind of voice that expected rooms to get quiet when she used it, and this room mostly did. "Are you the one who bought those 9 vehicles?" Mason turned from the table and looked at her. "I am," he said. She tilted her head slightly, like she was recalibrating something. Up close, he was harder to read than she'd expected. There was nothing defensive about how he stood, nothing eager either. He was just there, looking at her. "That's impressive," she said, and the way she said it meant the opposite. In terms of sheer commitment to a bad decision. A few people nearby heard this and looked over. The man with the camera definitely heard it. He was already filming. "You spent—" She glanced at his paperwork on the table, visible from where she stood. "Nearly $3,000 on vehicles that collectively aren't worth half that in current condition." "How do you know what they're worth?" Mason said. It was a simple question, not aggressive, genuinely simple. Like he actually wanted to know. "I run Sinclair Automotive Group," she said. "I know what every car in this room is worth." Mason looked at her steadily. "Did you walk the lot this morning?" "Briefly." "How long?" She paused. 15 minutes? 20. "I walked it for 90, he said. "But sure." He picked up his copies of the paperwork, folded them neatly, and put them in his jacket pocket. Vanessa felt something she didn't often feel in professional settings, which was the mild and very annoying sensation of not being sure she'd won an exchange. "Well," she said, and her voice had sharpened slightly, "I hope your daughter—" And she said it like she'd heard Roy mention it and was using it deliberately. "Appreciates what her father does with their savings." That one landed differently than the rest. The room felt it. Mason's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. He looked at Vanessa Sinclair with the specific attention of a person who has decided to take very accurate note of who they're talking to. "Have a good morning," he said, and he turned and walked back to his truck. The man with the camera got all of it. The towing alone took 3 trips. Mason had arranged it in advance, which Vanessa would have been surprised to know. He'd called a friend who ran a small towing operation 2 weeks ago, before the auction, before he'd confirmed a single vehicle would be there that he wanted, and worked out a rate and a schedule. The friend's name was Darnell, and he showed up with a rollback and a car hauler and absolutely 0 questions. Because Mason had once helped him swap an engine in a parking lot at 11 at night during a February cold snap, and that kind of thing created a certain loyalty. 9? Darnell said when he saw the vehicles. 9, Mason confirmed. Darnell looked at the lineup. He looked at the ambassador specifically for a long moment. "Huh. 3 trips, Mason said. "Start with the GTO and the Barracuda." "Your call." Darnell got to work. It took until almost 3 in the afternoon to get everything loaded and moved to the garage, an old service station on the edge of Kellerton that Mason had been renting by the month from a retired mechanic named Holt, who'd stopped coming around after his knees got bad, and had essentially surrendered the building to Mason the way you hand someone a fishing spot you've stopped using. The monthly rate was embarrassingly low. Holt had once told Mason's father that the building deserved someone who'd use it right, and he seemed to have made a decision about Mason a while back. The garage had 4 bays. 3 were now full. Mason stood in the doorway after Darnell left and looked at the 9 vehicles arranged across the space, each one a different kind of wreck, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't sure what to call it. Not confidence, exactly. Not happiness. Something more like alignment. The particular sensation of being in the right place, doing the right thing, even when everything around you still looked like a disaster. He took out the notebook. It was a Mead composition book, black and white, the same kind his father had used his entire adult life. Gerald Ryder had gone through maybe 100 of these over the course of his career, filling them with observations, measurements, restoration notes, contacts, and the particular shorthand he developed for cataloging vehicles he encountered. Mason had 43 of these notebooks in a box in his spare room. He'd been reading them since he was 9 years old. The notebook he pulled out now was special. It was one of the last ones his father had filled before he got sick, and it contained something Mason had spent 6 months trying to fully decode. Notes on a salvage facility outside Kellerton, where Gerald had apparently spent some time, maybe 15 years ago, cataloging vehicles for an estate case. The notes were incomplete. Gerald had gotten sick before he could follow up on whatever he'd found there. But the storage facility was the same one these 9 vehicles had come from. Mason was almost certain. He opened the notebook to a page near the middle and looked at his father's handwriting. Neat, small, precise. Gerald had written in pencil always, which meant some of the older notebooks were fading, but this one was still clear. Ambassador. 71. Fire damage, exterior. Interior, possibly salvageable. Frame clean, checked left rail at the firewall, solid. Engine bay, something not right here. Cover plate on the block, non-standard. Research. Kellerton Motor Works, 1969 to 1972. Ask Bertolucci. Mason had tracked down Bertolucci, a retired engineer named Paul Bertolucci, who'd worked for a now-defunct Michigan auto company in the early 1970s, 4 months ago. He'd driven 2 hours to talk to him, brought him a coffee and a piece of pie from the diner near his house, and spent 90 minutes listening to the old man talk. What Bertolucci had told him about that ambassador, he'd only told one other person, which was Lily, and she'd been asleep at the time, so it didn't really count. He picked Lily up from school at 3:30, same as always. She came out with her backpack hanging off one shoulder and her jacket unzipped in the February cold, and she had paint on her left hand and what looked like ketchup on her sleeve, and Mason looked at her and felt the particular complicated feeling that parents of young children live inside, which was something like, this is the whole of it, right here. Did you go? She said immediately. She knew about the auction, not the details, not the notebook, not Bertolucci, not what any of it might mean, but she knew her dad had been planning something and that today was the day. I went, Mason said. Did you get them? 9 of them. She stopped walking for a second and stared at him. 9? Is that good or bad in your opinion? Or she thought about this seriously, the way she took most things. Lily was 7, but she had the considered manner of someone who'd spent a lot of time around adults and had decided that if she was going to be around adults, she was going to pay attention to how they operated. It depends, she said finally. Are they the right 9? Mason smiled. It was one of the realest smiles he'd made in a while. Yeah, he said, I think they're the right 9. She nodded, satisfied, and got in the truck. On the drive home, she told him about a fight she'd witnessed between 2 kids at recess, reported with the fair-minded neutrality of someone who'd tried to understand both sides and landed on a verdict anyway. Then she told him about a bird she'd seen on the fence outside the cafeteria. Then she asked if they were having the mac and cheese with the breadcrumbs on top, or the regular kind. Regular, Mason said. She accepted this without complaint. After dinner, after dishes, after 45 minutes of homework that required Mason to recall things about fractions he hadn't thought about in 20 years, he got Lily into bed and sat on the edge of it in the dark room with the small star-shaped nightlight on the wall doing its thing. She'd had that nightlight since she was 2. He kept meaning to find out if it was too babyish for her now, but he didn't want to be the one to bring it up. Are you nervous? She asked. She was talking about the cars. A little. About the money? Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. Dad, do you know what you're doing? I think so. That's not the same as yes. No, he agreed. It's not. She seemed to find this acceptable. Okay. She closed her eyes, then, after a minute, don't let the lady be right. He looked at her. What lady? Roy's wife texted his wife, and she told Mom's sister, who told Mom, and Mom called me. She said a lady made fun of you at the auction on camera. Mason sat with that for a moment. Of course it had traveled. Of course it had. I'm not doing this to prove anything to anyone, he said. I know, Lily said, but still. He sat there until she was asleep. Then he went back to the garage. He worked until 2 a.m. He He started with the GTO because the GTO was the most straightforward, and he wanted a win in the first week. Something he could move quickly to prove the model was working. The damage was bad but concentrated. The front clip was destroyed, the bumper was gone, the hood was bent like a piece of paper. But the cowl was solid, the firewall was untouched, and the VIN plate told a story that the cosmetic damage was trying to hide. This was a real GTO. A matching numbers car with the original 400 cubic inch engine still sitting in the bay under a layer of surface rust and oil and approximately 15 years of indignity. He worked in the quiet of the garage, the only sounds the creak of the building when the wind hit it right, the occasional car on the road outside, and whatever work he was doing with his hands. He didn't play music when he worked. His father hadn't either. There was something about the silence that helped him hear what the car was telling him. His phone lit up twice before midnight. First was a text from his mother that said, "I heard about today. Call me," which he would deal with tomorrow. The second was a Google alert he'd set up 3 months ago that flagged new results for a search involving Sinclair Automotive Group, and a term that appeared in Paul Bertolucci's conversation, a specific engineering designation that Bertolucci had used when describing the prototype he'd helped design in the early 1970s. Mason read the notification. Then he set his phone face down on the workbench and kept working. The video of Vanessa Sinclair mocking him at the auction had, by that point, been viewed 47,000 times. He didn't know that yet. He also didn't know that Vanessa Sinclair had sent 2 people to the Hargrove Auction Records office that afternoon to find out the name on Bidder 47's registration forms. But he would find out. Eventually, he would find out a lot of things. For now, he set the breaker bar against the stuck manifold bolt and leaned into it, and the metal groaned and then gave, and he filed away the small satisfaction of that and kept going. The night was cold, and the garage wasn't well heated, and his breath made small clouds in the work light's glow. He had a coffee thermos on the bench that had been empty since 11:30. His knees ached from crouching, same as always. He worked until he couldn't anymore. Then he drove home, showered, set an alarm, and was asleep in 4 minutes. He was back in the garage by 6. The video hit 200,000 views by Friday. Mason found out about it from Darnell, who texted him a link with the message. "Bro, WTF is this?" He watched it once, sitting on a bucket in the garage with his phone in his greasy hand. The angle was slightly off. The blogger had been filming from the side, but you could see Vanessa's expression clearly, and you could hear what she said. The cutting part was the thing about Lily, the way she'd said it with that particular precision, like she'd chosen the exact point of entry. The comments were mostly on Mason's side, which he didn't particularly want or need, but they were also wrong about most of the details. People were calling it David versus Goliath and writing paragraphs about how the billionaire had disrespected a working-class hero, and Mason found that framing exhausting in a way he couldn't explain. He wasn't a symbol. He was just a guy trying to make something work. The fact that a powerful woman had been condescending to him at an auction was genuinely not the point. He texted Darnell back, "Working, stop sending me links." He did not watch the video again. What he did do that week was call Paul Bertolucci. "The ambassador is here," he said when Bertolucci answered. "I got it." There was a silence on the other end, long enough that Mason checked his phone to see if the call had dropped. "You actually did it," Bertolucci said finally. "I need to verify the plate markings, the ones you described. You need to be careful." "I know." Another pause. "Mason." Bertolucci's voice was different now, lower, more deliberate. "When I told you about that vehicle, I didn't tell you everything. There are people, companies, who have been looking for it for a long time, not just Sinclair." "I know that too." "Do you understand what I mean when I say be careful?" Mason looked across the garage at the ambassador, still covered with its green tarp. "Tell me the rest," he said. "Tell me what you didn't say last time." And Bertolucci did. It took 40 minutes. Mason sat on the bucket the whole time and didn't take a single note, because some things you don't write down until you're sure who might be reading. When Bertolucci finished, Mason said, "Okay, that's all you've got? Okay? I need to think about it. Mason, I'll call you when I've looked at the plate markings." He paused. "Thank you, Paul, for telling me." He hung up and sat in the quiet garage with 9 damaged cars for company and thought about what Bertolucci had told him and about his father's notebook, and about the fact that the owner of Sinclair Automotive Group had already found out his name and was almost certainly going to show up wanting something. He got up, walked to the ambassador, and pulled the green tarp back. In the cold light of the garage, even burned and destroyed, the car looked like it had been waiting for him. But to see... He found the plate markings 20 minutes later in exactly the place Bertolucci had said they'd be, hidden behind a non-standard cover plate on the engine block, accessible only once you removed a section that had been welded over sometime in the mid-70s to look like a standard repair. Bertolucci had told him what tool he'd need. Bertolucci had been right. The markings were small, precise, almost certainly meaningless to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. But Mason had spent 4 months learning exactly what he was looking for. He photographed them with his phone, unhurried, every angle, every character. Then he replaced the cover plate. Then he put the tarp back. He went back to the GTO and kept working on the manifold. Outside, the February wind was doing something miserable and complicated to the garage's metal roof. Somewhere down the road, a dog was barking at nothing. The work light hummed its single quiet note. Mason Ryder, mechanic, single father, 32 years old with grease on his hands and his father's notebook in his jacket pocket, had just found something that Sinclair Automotive Group had spent millions of dollars and 2 years searching for. He needed the rest of the evening to figure out what he was going to do about that. So he worked on the GTO, and he thought, and the car slowly began to become something better than it had been. That was enough, for now. That was enough. The GTO was the first one to come back. It took Mason 11 days. 11 days of early mornings and late nights, of ordering parts from 3 different suppliers, of calling in a favor from a guy in Lansing who had a correct year front clip sitting in his field under a piece of plywood, of lying on cold concrete with his arms inside the engine bay while his back reminded him that he was 32 and not 22. He ate a lot of sandwiches. He slept badly. He missed 2 of Lily's dinners, which he hated, and made up for it both times by picking her up from school himself and letting her spend an hour in the garage asking questions about whatever he was working on, which she did with the focused curiosity of someone who wasn't especially interested in cars, but was very interested in how her father thought about them. "Why do you keep touching the same spot on the frame?" she asked him once, watching him crouch near the GTO's left rear quarter. "Feeling for flex," he said. "What does flex feel like?" "Wrong," he said. "It feels wrong." She considered this. "And this one feels right?" "This one feels right." She nodded like that made complete sense, and went back to drawing in the small sketchbook she always brought to the garage. She drew cars sometimes, but mostly she drew the garage itself, the angles of the work lights, the shadows under the lifts, the way the tools hung on the pegboard in what she once described as a pattern that was trying to be a pattern. Mason had framed one of those drawings and put it on the wall near the office space, which was not really an office, just a folding table with a lamp and a filing box. Lily had pretended to be embarrassed about it. She checked every time she came in to make sure it was still there. When the GTO was done, Mason drove it exactly once, alone, at 6 in the morning before Lily was awake, down the empty highway toward the edge of town and back. He wasn't testing it for show. He was listening to it, feeling what it did under acceleration and what it said when he braked, and whether the whole thing spoke the same language, or whether some parts were still arguing with each other. The 400 engine had taken a week of careful work to resurrect, cleaning the carburetor twice, replacing the fuel lines, finding a voltage regulator from a parts guy in Ohio who had specifically said on the phone that he didn't ship to Michigan before Mason convinced him otherwise. But when it ran like it was explaining something. It ran like a car that had been waiting a long time to be taken seriously. He drove back to the garage, parked it in the light, and looked at it for a while. Red, almost burgundy in the morning light, with chrome that had taken him 3 separate sessions to bring back from the oxidized gray it had been when he bought it. There was a small imperfection in the passenger side door where the metal had been worked and worked again and still held the ghost of its old crease if you looked at it from the right angle in certain light. He'd decided to leave it. Some people would see it, most wouldn't. Either way, it was honest. He took 12 photos, posted them to a private forum for serious collectors he'd been a member of for 4 years under his own name but without much history, and went inside to make Lily's breakfast. By the time he got back to the garage that afternoon, he had 4 private messages. By the end of the week, he had a buyer, a collector in Nashville who'd been looking for a numbers-matching 70 GTO for 2 years and who, after a 30-minute phone call with Mason and a second set of photos, wired a deposit without asking to see it in person first. The final sale price was $41,000. Mason sat in the garage after he got the confirmation and did the math on a piece of notebook paper, not his phone, the same way his father had always done it. He sat there for a while after the math was done because the number on the paper was real and the cars around him were real, and he needed a minute for those two things to connect. His phone rang. It was his mother. "Roy Pittman told his wife you sold the GTO," she said without saying hello. Word travels. Mason. Her voice had the specific texture it got when she was trying to say something important without sounding like she was trying to say something important. "How much?" He told her. There was a silence that had several emotions in it. "Your father would have," she started and then stopped. "I know, Mom." Another silence. Then, "Are you eating?" "I'm eating." "Lily said you forgot dinner twice last week." "I made up for it." "Mason, Mom, I'm okay. I promise." He looked at the empty bay where the GTO had been. "I'm actually okay." She didn't sound entirely convinced, but she let it go. That was the thing about his mother. She always let it go eventually, which was its own kind of love. After he hung up, he pulled the green tarp on the Ambassador tighter at the corners and started thinking about which car to touch next. He chose the Barracuda. The Barracuda made sense financially, and it would keep him busy enough that he wouldn't spend too much time thinking about what was under the tarp. He needed more time before he dealt with that. The problem was, time had already started moving without his permission. 3 days after he posted the GTO photos to the collector forum, a message appeared in his inbox from an account with no photo and a username that was a random string of characters. The message was short. It said, "We know what you found in the Ambassador. We'd like to discuss an arrangement before you make decisions you'll regret. This is a professional courtesy, not a threat." There was a phone number at the bottom. Mason read it twice. Then he forwarded it to a throwaway email account he kept for things he didn't know what to do with yet, and deleted it from his main inbox. He didn't call the number. He sat on the knowledge of it the way you sit on a stone in your shoe when you're in the middle of a long walk, aware of it constantly, but making a decision, for now, not to stop. The Barracuda took 9 days. The Charger took 2 weeks because the framework was more involved than he'd expected. There was damage to the right front rail that hadn't been visible from outside, and he spent 3 days debating whether to push through it or walk away from the restoration, and ultimately decided that walking away would bother him more than the work. He called a frame specialist in Pontiac named Bev, a 58-year-old woman who'd been straightening frames since before Mason was born, and who had once, famously, told a customer that his idea of how to fix a twisted frame was an insult to physics. Bev drove out on a Tuesday, looked at the Charger for 20 minutes, told Mason exactly what needed to happen, and charged him for the visit in a way that was fair and made no concessions for the fact that she liked him. "Your dad used to send me the hardest ones," Bev said before she left. "I know, he talked about you." She looked at him for a moment. "He was proud of you, just so you know." Mason didn't say anything to that. He thanked her for coming out, and she got in her truck and left, and he went back to work. The Charger, when it was done, was something. It was an actual, genuine something. The orange was correct. He'd matched it to a paint code from a reference book his father had annotated, and the interior had taken a week of careful sourcing, but he'd found correct year material from a supplier in Georgia who specialized in Mopar restorations and who had been initially reluctant to deal with someone he didn't know. Mason had sent him photos of the Charger's progress, 1 set per week, for 3 weeks running. On the 4th week, the supplier had called him directly, and they'd talked for an hour, and after that, there was no more reluctance. By this point, it was mid-March. Mason had been working for 5 weeks. He had sold 2 vehicles and had $56,000 sitting in his account, which was more money than he'd had at any single point in his adult life. And he still had 7 cars to go, and the tarp in the corner of the garage, and the message from the anonymous account that he hadn't answered, and a growing awareness that things were moving toward a point of intersection he couldn't avoid forever. The video of Vanessa Sinclair at the auction had by now been viewed 800,000 times. Someone had turned it into a montage. Someone else had made a response video that was mostly wrong about the facts, but very emotionally compelling. A journalist from an automotive trade publication had sent Mason an email requesting an interview, which he'd ignored. A different journalist from a general interest magazine had sent a second email, more persistent, which he'd also ignored. He didn't want to be the story. He'd never wanted to be the story. But the story, it turned out, had its own ideas about that. It was a Thursday morning when a black Escalade pulled into the gravel lot outside the garage. Mason was under the Plymouth Satellite. He'd decided to tackle the Satellite next, partly because the body damage was deceptive, and the car underneath it was in better shape than it looked. And he heard the crunch of tires on gravel and the specific weight of an expensive vehicle moving slowly and deliberately, and he knew before he rolled out from under the car who it probably was. He took his time. He finished what he was doing with the socket wrench, replaced the socket in its holder on the cart, wiped his hands on a shop rag that was already past the point of actually getting hands clean, and rolled out from under the Satellite. Marcus was standing in the garage doorway. He was holding a leather portfolio and wearing a coat that was too nice for a garage visit, which meant someone had sent him here on short notice without time to change. "Mr. Ryder," Marcus said. "You can come in," Mason said. "Try not to touch anything." Marcus stepped inside carefully, looking around at the garage with an expression that was trying to stay neutral. He saw the Charger in the nearest bay, done now, gleaming, and something in his expression adjusted involuntarily. "That's a '69 Charger," he said. "It is. It's remarkable." "I know." Mason set the shop rag on the cart. "What do you need?" Marcus cleared his throat. He opened the portfolio. "Ms. Sinclair would like to arrange a meeting with you. At your convenience." "What does she want to talk about?" A brief pause. "There are some items from the Hargrove auction that may be of interest to Sinclair Automotive Group." Mason looked at him. "The auction was 6 weeks ago. She had plenty of time at the auction to be interested." "Mr. Ryder—" "She wasn't interested in talking to me at the auction. She was interested in making a point in front of cameras." He said it without heat, just as a fact, the way you describe weather. "Tell me what she actually wants." Marcus closed the portfolio. He had the look of a man who had been given specific instructions and was now trying to figure out how far outside those instructions he was allowed to go. He made a decision. "She wants to discuss one of the vehicles, specifically." "Which one?" Another pause. This one lasted long enough that Mason could hear the wind outside working at the garage roof. "The 1971 Ambassador." Mason had known that was coming. He'd known it for a while. He nodded slowly, like he was taking a note internally, and said, "Tell her I'll think about it." She was hoping for a timeline. "I'll think about it," Mason said again. He picked up a different wrench and turned back to the Satellite. "Thanks for coming out." Marcus stood there for another moment. Then he said quietly, not quite professionally, "For what it's worth, the Charger is one of the best restorations I've ever seen." Mason didn't turn around. "Close the door on your way out. It's cold." He heard the Escalade leave 10 minutes later, after Marcus had apparently sat in it for a while first. Mason kept working. He worked until noon, then drove to pick up Lily's lunch, then came back. He called Bertolucci that afternoon. "She sent someone," Mason said. "I expected that." Bertolucci's voice was careful. "What did they say?" "Wanted a meeting about the ambassador." "And?" "I told him I'd think about it." Mason paused. "The other message, the one from the anonymous account. I need you to tell me who that is, Paul." A long silence. "Where did you read about it?" "The account used a specific term, an engineering designation, the same one you used when you described the prototype. That's not a coincidence." More silence. Then Bertolucci said heavily, "There's a company called Meridian Motor Technologies. They were a competitor of the company I worked for in the 70s. They've been in litigation with Sinclair Automotive for 2 years over the engine design. If Sinclair wins the lawsuit, Meridian loses licensing rights worth somewhere north of $300 million. If the prototype surfaces as evidence, Sinclair wins. Yes. And Meridian knows the prototype exists. They've known longer than Sinclair has," Bertolucci said. "That message you got. They're not just offering you money to sell it to them." He paused. "They want you to make it disappear." Mason sat with that for a minute. Outside the garage window, the March light was doing something flat and gray over the parking lot. A crow was sitting on the fence post that marked the edge of the property, doing nothing in particular. "How long has this lawsuit been going?" Mason asked. 22 months. Trial is in about 3 months. Sinclair's team has been looking for the prototype for most of that time. They knew Gerald had cataloged it. There's apparently a reference in some storage facility paperwork, but they couldn't prove it still existed or where it had gone. "My father," Mason said quietly. "He found it before he got sick. I think he meant to deal with it, but then—" Bertolucci didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Mason thought about his father in a salvage facility 15 years ago, writing notes in a composition book with his small, precise handwriting. Finding something important. Getting sick before he could do anything about it. Leaving the notebooks in a box for a son who took 6 months to understand what he'd left. "Okay," Mason said. "You keep saying that. It's what I've got right now." He looked at the green tarp. "I'm not going to sell it to Meridian. I didn't think you would. And I'm not going to just hand it to Sinclair either. Not after—" He stopped. "Not after what she said," Bertolucci supplied. "It's not even about that." Mason shifted the phone to his other ear. "I want to understand what I have before I do anything with it. Completely. Not 90%. All of it." "That's smart. It's what my dad would have done." "Yes," Bertolucci said. "It is." After he hung up, Mason went back to work on the satellite. He worked until 7, picked up Lily from his neighbor Claire's house, where Lily stayed on garage days, brought her home, made dinner, actual dinner, pasta from scratch, not sandwiches, and sat at the kitchen table with her while she told him about a book she was reading about a girl who discovered a secret room in her grandmother's house. "What's in the room?" Mason asked. "I haven't finished it yet." She twirled pasta around her fork with great concentration. "But I think it's something that was supposed to be lost. Something somebody hid." Mason looked at his plate. Do you think people hide things on purpose?" Lily asked. "Or do things just get lost and then it looks like they were hidden?" He thought about a composition book and a salvage facility and a green tarp. "Both," he said. "I think both happen." She considered this seriously. "That makes it harder to know what you're supposed to do with it when you find it." "Yeah," Mason said. "It does." She finished her pasta. He washed the dishes. She went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in the quiet of the house that was his, thinking about what he was going to do. He didn't call Marcus back that night, but he wrote Vanessa Sinclair's name on a piece of paper and put it on the table in front of him, and he thought about the way she'd said it. "I hope your daughter appreciates what her father does with their savings." And he thought about what it meant that she'd found out Lily existed in the space of 2 sentences and had used that information in the space of 1. That told him something. It told him she was someone who assessed situations and deployed information quickly, and that when she felt off balance, she went for the thing that would reestablish distance between herself and whoever was making her feel that way. He understood that, in its own way. He wasn't without sympathy for it. But he also knew what it meant about the kind of meeting she was expecting when they eventually sat down together. She was expecting to walk into a garage and leave with what she wanted. She was wrong about that. But she didn't know she was wrong yet. And that was the only advantage Mason had, and he intended to use it carefully. The next 2 weeks were the busiest of his life. He finished the satellite, which turned out to be a 70 and not a 69 as the listing had guessed, a meaningful distinction in terms of value, and photographed it and listed it through the form and got 3 inquiries within 48 hours. He sold it for $29,000 to a man in Arizona who'd been restoring Mopars for 20 years and called Mason back after the sale just to talk about it for another hour, which Mason found he didn't mind. He finished a 65 Mustang Fastback that had been hiding under the worst-looking exterior in the lot. The fire damage on the body was almost theatrical, and 2 experienced collectors had told him privately they thought the car was a total loss. Mason had spent a week just cleaning before he started any actual restoration, stripping the burned exterior layer by layer to find out what the car actually was underneath all that damage. What it was turned out to be mostly intact. The fastback body was solid in the places that mattered. The roof skin needed replacing, which was expensive and took 9 days, including waiting on shipping. But the result was a car that had no business looking the way it did, given where it had started. He sold the Mustang for $52,000. He got 2 calls from other sellers after that asking if he'd be willing to look at their projects. He started returning those calls. The garage was changing around him, slowly, the way things change when you're too close to notice each individual step. The pegboard on the north wall had been reorganized twice because his workflow had changed and the tools needed to be where the work was happening. He'd put up a second set of work lights in the third bay. He'd bought a proper engine stand to replace the improvised setup he'd been using, which was one of those purchases that felt extravagant until the first time you used it and then felt indispensable. He'd also, on a Tuesday afternoon when Lily was with her mother for the week, spent 4 hours cleaning the office corner and setting up an actual desk situation, a used drafting table from a closing architect's office found on Marketplace for $40, which was the right height and had the right kind of work surface and made him feel, in a way he couldn't entirely justify, like this was a real place now and not just a building he was borrowing. He pinned his father's photograph to the wall above the drafting table. Gerald Ryder, maybe 40 years old in the photo, standing next to a '67 Shelby GT 500 he'd restored for a client that year. He was holding a coffee cup and squinting at the camera like he hadn't expected anyone to take a picture, which was probably true. He was not a posed for photos kind of man. Mason looked at the photo for a while after he pinned it up. Then he sat down at the drafting table and opened the composition book and read through the ambassador notes again. All of them, from the first reference to the last. Then he called Marcus and told him he'd meet with Vanessa Sinclair. He had one condition on the meeting. It had to be here, in the garage. Not her office, not a restaurant, not a conference room in some building where she controlled the environment. The garage. Marcus called back within 10 minutes to say she'd agreed. Mason wasn't surprised. She wanted the ambassador badly enough to agree to terms she wouldn't normally agree to. What she didn't know yet was that the terms of the meeting were the least of it. The meeting was set for a Friday afternoon, 2 days away. Mason spent those 2 days finishing a detail job on the Charger that he'd been putting off, and thinking and not talking to anyone about any of it except Bertolucci, who he called once more to confirm a specific technical detail about the prototype's markings, a detail he wanted to be absolutely certain of before he sat across from Vanessa Sinclair's legal team, because she wouldn't come alone. He knew that. Whatever she agreed to about the location, she would bring lawyers. She would bring leverage. She would walk in with the same confidence she'd walked into the auction warehouse with, and she would have a number ready, and she would expect him to take it. He thought about that a lot. He thought about the number she would offer and whether it would be a real number or a tactical number. And he thought about his father's handwriting in the composition book, and about Bertolucci saying there are people who have been looking for this a long time, and about Lily asking whether things got lost or hidden on purpose. He thought about what he actually wanted out of this, not what he could get. What he wanted. By Thursday night, he had his answer. It surprised him, a little, how simple it was when he finally let himself arrive at it. He'd been circling around it for weeks, thinking it had to be more complicated, but it wasn't. It was just a thing he wanted, specific and clear, with no performance in it. Friday morning, he cleaned the garage. Not for her benefit, for his. He cleaned it because it was his space and he wanted it right. He organized the tools. He swept the floor, which he did regularly anyway, but did more thoroughly than usual. He made sure the photograph of his father was straight. The Charger sat in the first bay, visible from the door. The ambassador sat in the corner, still under its green tarp. He made a thermos of coffee, poured a cup, sat on his stool near the drafting table, and waited. The black Escalade pulled into the lot at exactly 2 o'clock. Then a second car, a gray sedan with law firm plates if you knew what to look for. Then Vanessa Sinclair's personal vehicle, not the Escalade, something lower and faster and less obvious, a dark blue sedan that she drove herself. Mason watched through the garage window as she got out. No coat, even in March. Dark blazer, dark slacks, the kind of boots that were professional but also clearly chosen by someone who thought about what they wore. She looked at the building for a moment before she came in, the way she'd looked at the auction warehouse, assessing, organizing, preparing. Then she looked at the window and saw him looking back at her. And something shifted in her expression that she didn't have time to control. She hadn't expected him to already be watching. Mason set down his coffee cup, stood up, and walked to the garage door to let them in. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to happen here, in his father's kind of place, with the tools hung right and the photograph on the wall and the ambassador in the corner waiting under its green tarp for someone to finally decide what to do with it. He opened the door. She came in first, ahead of her lawyers, which Mason hadn't expected. The two attorneys followed a half-step behind, a man in his 50s with silver-rimmed glasses and the deliberate posture of someone who billed by the hour and was aware of it, and a younger woman carrying a leather briefcase who looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days and was managing it professionally. Marcus brought up the rear and positioned himself near the door in a way that suggested he was used to being the last person in and the first person out. Vanessa Sinclair walked into the garage and stopped. She looked at the Charger in the first bay. She stood there for a full 4 or 5 seconds, which was long enough that the attorney with the silver glasses glanced at her sideways. Then she moved her attention to the second bay, where the Mustang Fastback's replacement, a half-disassembled AMC Javelin that Mason had started on Monday, sat with its hood removed and its engine bay open like a patient mid-surgery. Then she looked at the drafting table with the photograph above it, and her eyes moved to Gerald Ryder's face for a moment before she turned to face Mason. "Mr. Ryder," she said. "Ms. Sinclair." He didn't offer his hand, neither did she. "You can use those stools over there if you want to sit. I've got coffee. It's in the thermos." She looked at the stools, shop stools, padded seats, the kind that swivel, not what her attorneys were used to. The man with the silver glasses looked at his stool the way people look at chairs on airplanes, committing to acceptance before sitting down. "We'd like to talk about the 1971 ambassador," the attorney said. His name, he'd said in an introductory email Marcus had forwarded, was Gareth Cole. He had the kind of voice that had been trained to project certainty. "Specifically, we'd like to discuss Sinclair Automotive Group's interest in acquiring the vehicle." "I know what you're here about," Mason said. He was leaning against the workbench with his arms crossed, not aggressively, just the way he stood when he wasn't doing anything with his hands. "What I don't know yet is what she's actually offering." Cole started to say something, and Vanessa spoke first. $200,000, she said. Cash. Transferred within 72 hours of agreement. Clean title, no conditions, no press involvement. The number landed in the room. Mason didn't react to it visibly, which Cole watched with the professional interest of a man who reads people's responses to large numbers for a living. "That's a real number," Mason said. "It is. The Ambassador, in its current condition, is worth maybe $12,000 to $15,000 as a restoration project. You know that." He looked at her. "So the other 185 is for the prototype markings and whatever they prove in your lawsuit." Something moved across Vanessa's face. It was controlled almost immediately, but it had been there. She hadn't expected him to say prototype markings in a sentence like that. Factually, specifically, without preamble. "Where did you—" Cole started. "I've done my research," Mason said. He wasn't triumphant about it. He said it the same way he said most things. "I know what the Ambassador is. I know what those markings establish. I know that your trial is in about 3 months, and that Meridian Motor Technologies has been in litigation with your company for 22 months over an engine design that the prototype can prove originated with your predecessor company, not theirs." The room was very quiet. The March wind was doing something to the metal roof of the garage. Somewhere outside, a truck downshifted on the road. "I also know," Mason continued, "that someone from Meridian sent me a message 3 weeks ago asking me to make the prototype disappear." That one hit differently. Vanessa Sinclair looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the cold confidence from the auction, not the assessing look from the parking lot. Something more direct. Something that was closer to actual attention. "What did you say to them?" she asked. "Nothing." I didn't respond. Cole leaned forward slightly. "Do you still have the message?" "Yes." "We'd very much like—" "I'm sure you would." Mason looked at Vanessa, not Cole. $200,000 is a real offer, but I'm not taking it." Cole opened his mouth. Vanessa held up one hand, a small gesture, and he closed it. "Why not?" she asked. "Because it solves your problem and hands you a $185,000 profit over what you paid me for solving it. And because money isn't what I'm after." "Then what are you after?" Mason reached back and picked up a folder from the drafting table. He held it for a moment without opening it, like he was deciding one more time whether this was the right call. Then he set it on the workbench between them. "I want Sinclair Automotive Group to fund a restoration training program. 3-year commitment, minimum. For young mechanics, Kids who don't have the resources to apprentice anywhere legitimate, kids aging out of foster care, kids in vocational programs that are underfunded, hands-on, structured, real. Not a scholarship fund with your logo on it, an actual program with instructors who know what they're doing. He paused. That folder has a rough proposal, numbers, structure, what it would look like. Nobody said anything for a moment. Cole looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at the folder. Then she looked at Mason and said, with something that wasn't quite cynicism but was adjacent to it, "You want me to build a charity program in exchange for evidence that could be worth hundreds of millions to my company. I want you to build something that lasts," Mason said. "The lawsuit money is yours whether you build it or not. Whether you win or lose, you'll still be worth billions. I'm not interested in your money." He nodded at the folder. "I'm interested in that." Vanessa picked up the folder. She opened it and looked at the first page and the second. She was a fast reader. Mason could tell by the way her eyes moved. And she went through the first 4 pages in less than 2 minutes while the room stayed quiet. Cole looked at his phone. The younger attorney looked at the charger. Marcus looked at a point on the wall just above Mason's head. Vanessa closed the folder. "No publicity," she said. It wasn't a question. It was her trying to understand the architecture of what he was asking. "No publicity," Mason confirmed. "No naming rights. No press releases about the Sinclair Foundation doing good works. The program can operate under whatever name makes it functional. I don't care what it's called." She studied him. "You spent nearly $3,000 on a pile of ruined cars, spent 2 months restoring them, and walked into a situation where you could have taken $200,000, and what you actually want is a vocational program for at-risk kids." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the high windows of the garage at the angle it hit around 3 o'clock, and it caught the edge of the charger's chrome and threw a narrow line of light across the concrete floor between them. Why? Mason thought about how to answer that. He could have given her the clean version. Something about his father, something about giving back, something quotable. Instead, he said, "My dad spent his whole career trying to pass this on. He taught anyone who'd show up and pay attention. He didn't make a lot of money. He didn't get famous. But there are maybe 40 people in this region who know how to restore a car correctly because he took the time with them. And every one of those people passed something on to somebody else." He looked at the photograph on the wall without pointing at it. He died thinking he hadn't finished. I want something that finishes it. The room was quiet again, differently than before. Cole looked up from his phone. Even the younger attorney, who'd been maintaining the careful professional stillness of someone in the background of a negotiation, was looking at Mason now. "Vanessa." Sinclair set the folder down on the workbench. She looked at it, then at him, and he watched her do something he hadn't expected to watch her do, which was think. Not process, not calculate, actually think, the way people do when something has moved the ground under them and they need to find their footing in a new place. "I need to have my team review the proposal," she said. "Structurally, legally, financially. That's fine. This doesn't mean I'm agreeing. I know. And I still want the vehicle and the documentation." "You'll get both if we reach an agreement," Mason said. "All of the documentation, including the message from Meridian." Cole stirred. "The Meridian communication may be relevant to a separate—" "Gareth," Vanessa said quietly. Cole went still. She looked at Mason one more time. It was a different kind of looking than at the auction, different from the parking lot, different from the beginning of this meeting. It was the look of someone who had walked into a room expecting one kind of person and was now standing across from a different kind entirely and was trying to figure out when exactly the substitution had happened. "I'll be in touch by Monday," she said. "Take the time you need," Mason said. She picked up the folder and handed it to Marcus, who tucked it under his arm. Cole gathered himself. There were papers he'd been prepared to present, a counteroffer structure he'd clearly built and now wasn't sure how to deploy, and stood. The younger attorney was already at the door. Vanessa Sinclair was almost to the door herself when she stopped. She turned around and looked at the first bay, at the charger, for a moment. Then she said, without looking at Mason, "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" She gestured at the car. That restoration. Where did you learn it?" "My father," Mason said. She nodded once, like she'd already known the answer and was just confirming it. Then she walked out. Mason stood in the garage and listened to the cars start in the lot. The blue sedan last, pulling out slowly, gravel crunching, and then the sound fading down the road toward Kellerton proper. He stood there for a minute after the sound was gone, in the particular silence that follows the exit of people who brought a lot of energy into a room. Then he turned around, went back to the Javelin, and kept working. He wasn't confident. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He wasn't standing in his garage feeling like he'd won something. The proposal in that folder was real, and it cost him something to hand it over, not financially, but in terms of exposure. He'd written those pages at the kitchen table on a Wednesday night after Lily was in bed, with the composition book open next to him, and parts of it were things he'd been thinking about for years and had never said out loud to anyone. Handing them to a billionaire he didn't trust was not a comfortable feeling. It was the necessary feeling, the right direction feeling, but not comfortable. He worked on the Javelin until 7. Then he drove to pick up Lily. She could read him the way kids who've spent a lot of time closely watching their parents learn to read them. Not perfectly, but in broad strokes, the way you read weather. She looked at him across the dinner table and said, "The lady came today?" "She did." "What happened?" "I told her what I wanted." Lily pushed her rice around. "Did she laugh at you again?" "No," Mason said. "She didn't." Lily looked up. "Was she nice?" Mason thought about that seriously. "No," he said finally. "But she was real. That's different." His daughter turned this over. "I think I understand that," she said, in the way she sometimes said things that suggested she understood more than a 7-year-old had any reason to. Monday came and went without a call from Marcus or Vanessa or anyone at Sinclair Automotive. Tuesday, same. Mason worked. He finished the detail work on the Javelin's interior and started making calls about the engine, which was not original to the car and needed to be addressed before he could properly assess the restoration path. He sold the Plymouth Barracuda on Tuesday afternoon to a buyer who'd found him through the collector forum and who drove up from Columbus specifically to look at it. The buyer was a quiet man named Ed, 60 years old, who walked around the Barracuda 3 times without saying anything and then said, "It's right," which Mason took as the highest possible compliment. That sale brought his running total to just over $120,000 since the auction. Wednesday morning, a different car pulled into the garage lot. Not an Escalade. Not anything from Sinclair. It was a rented sedan, the kind that rental companies have in bulk. Silver, anonymous, midsize, and the man who got out of it was wearing clothes that were trying hard not to look expensive. He was around 40, compact, with the kind of stillness in his face that wasn't peaceful but controlled. Mason watched from the garage window. He'd been watching the lot more carefully since Bertolucci's warning. The man knocked on the garage door. Mason opened it. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Ryder?" The man smiled. It was a professional smile, the kind that's been practiced until it looks close enough to real. "My name is Daniel Fitch. I represent some interests in the Meridian Motor Technologies matter. I was hoping we could speak privately." "I don't have anything private to say to Meridian." Fitch kept the smile. "We haven't had a chance to fully explain our position. The message you received, I understand the phrasing was unfortunate. What we're actually proposing is quite straightforward." He paused. $350,000 for the vehicle and any associated documentation. No further obligations. Mason looked at him. "The message I received said you wanted to make the prototype disappear." "That was a miscommunication, a phrasing issue. We want to acquire it for legitimate research purposes." "The trial is in 10 weeks, Mason said. "Meridian losing means losing licensing rights worth $300 million. I know what the prototype means to your litigation." He tilted his head slightly. "There's nothing legitimate about 350 in a rented sedan." Fitch's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "Mr. Ryder, you're holding something that has implications beyond your garage. People far more powerful than you are involved in this. The smart play is to take the money, transfer the vehicle, and be done with it." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm advising you." The smile again. "As a courtesy." Mason looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to need you to leave my property." "Mr. Ryder, now, please." Fitch looked at him for a beat longer than he needed to. Then he took a card from his inside pocket and held it out. Mason didn't take it. Fitch set it on the ground near the door, which was the move of a man who was used to getting the last word, even when he wasn't winning the conversation. Then he walked back to the silver sedan and drove away. Mason picked up the card. He looked at it. A real company name, a real phone number, an address in Chicago. He took a photo of it and texted the photo to Bertolucci. Then he went inside, sat at the drafting table, and wrote down everything he could remember from the conversation, in the composition book, because some things you do write down. He called Bertolucci 20 minutes later. Fitch came to the garage, he said. In person? Bertolucci's voice sharpened. Be very careful, Mason. I'm careful. I mean it. Meridian has moved past the messaging stage. If they sent someone physically to your location, they offered $350, which you didn't take. Which I didn't take. A pause. Are you going to tell Sinclair? Mason sat with that. It was the question he'd been turning around since Fitch's rental car left the lot. Telling Vanessa meant giving her something, which had its own set of implications. Not telling her meant sitting on information about active interference in a legal proceeding, which was its own different set of implications. He'd spent the last hour trying to figure out which set was worse and kept arriving at the same answer. Yeah, he said. I'm going to tell her. How? Directly. He paused. Not through Marcus. He had Vanessa Sinclair's personal number, Sambakambras. Marcus had included it in one of his emails as a formality, in case of emergency line that Mason had written down and not used. He looked at it now on the notepad beside the drafting table. He'd been looking at it on and off since Monday. He called it. She picked up on the third ring. Ryder. She'd saved his number, apparently. Meridian sent someone to my garage this morning, he said. In person. A man named Daniel Fitch. He offered me $350,000 to transfer the vehicle and documentation to them. A brief, controlled silence. What did you say? I told him to leave. Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice had a quality it hadn't had in any of their previous conversations. Not warm, exactly, but real in a different way. Less architecture to it. Have you documented the contact? I've got a photo of his card and written notes on the conversation. I can forward both. Yes. Please do that. A beat. Why are you telling me this? It was a direct question. She seemed like someone who, when she asked direct questions, wanted direct answers and could tell the difference. Because someone approaching me is one thing. If they escalate to something that affects you or your case, you should know it's coming. That's not self-interest, she said. It wasn't exactly an accusation. More like she was testing the weight of it. No, Mason agreed. It's not. The line was quiet for a moment. Then, I've had my team review your proposal. And? It's more detailed than I expected. The budget is realistic. The structure is sound. She paused. The section on instructor selection, you specified that at least 2/3 of instructors need to have come up through working-class trades, not through academic programs. I did. Why? Because the thing my father was teaching wasn't in textbooks, Mason said. You learn it by watching someone who learned it the same way. You break that chain and you lose something that can't be written down. She was quiet for long enough that Mason thought she might be looking at the proposal pages. Monday, she said finally. I'll have a formal response Monday. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it correctly. That's all I'm asking. She hung up without a formal goodbye, which was becoming a pattern. Mason set down the phone and sat in the garage for a while, listening to the building exist around him, the metal and the cold and the work lights and the cars in their various stages, the Ambassador under its tarp, the Javelin with its hood off, the photograph of his father on the wall. He thought about what Fitch had said, people far more powerful than you are involved in this, and recognized it as both a true statement and a meaningless one, because power and leverage were different things, and he had the leverage, and he knew it, and more importantly, he knew how to not use it badly. That was the thing nobody on either side of this seemed to fully understand yet. Mason wasn't holding the Ambassador over Vanessa Sinclair's head. He wasn't leveraging it against Meridian. He was simply sitting with what he had and deciding carefully what it was for. His father's notebooks had taught him this, without teaching it explicitly. The idea that finding something important came with a responsibility about what you did next. Not legally, not financially, just in terms of who you wanted to be when it was done. He'd had plenty of opportunities in the past 6 weeks to be a different version of himself. He'd had the chance to sell to Meridian and walk away with money that would have changed his life on paper. He'd had the chance to exploit the media story. The video was north of 1 million views by now, and 2 production companies had reached out through the garage's newly active social media account that Mason hadn't known existed until Roy Pittman mentioned it. Apparently managed by someone in the collector forum who decided Mason's story needed telling. He'd ignored all of it. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to be done. Friday came, and with it something he hadn't anticipated. He was at the school pickup line in the GMC, the engine making the sound it always made, but more so in cold weather, when his phone buzzed with a news alert. He'd set up a few of these for terms related to the Sinclair-Meridian litigation, the same way his father used to clip newspaper stories about companies he tracked. The alert was from an automotive trade publication. The headline was short: Meridian Motor Technologies faces independent investigation over alleged evidence tampering in Sinclair lawsuit. Mason read the article while Lily's class let out. It was thin on details. Most of the substance was clearly happening behind closed doors. But one paragraph mentioned that a Meridian employee had made direct contact with a third party in possession of material relevant to the litigation and had offered financial inducement for the material's suppression. Mason's name wasn't in the article. The Kellerton garage wasn't mentioned. But it was there, between the lines of it, the shape of what had happened. He put the phone in his pocket when Lily opened the truck door and climbed in. "You have that face," she said. "What face?" "The one where something happened and you're deciding whether it's good or bad." He pulled out of the school line. "Something happened. Good or bad?" "Both, I think, but more good." She buckled her seatbelt and looked out the window. "Is the lady going to be okay?" He glanced over at her. He told Lily almost nothing about the specifics, just that there was a complicated situation involving one of the cars. But Lily had been listening to adult conversations her whole life and had assembled more of the picture than he'd given her credit for. "She's going to be fine," Mason said. "Are you going to be okay?" "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "You always say I think so when you mean yes," Lily said. "But you say it like it's more true than just yes." He drove for a while without answering. They passed the edge of the Kellerton proper, the hardware store, the diner where people still went at 6 in the morning, the road that used to have a gas station before it became a vape shop. "Your grandmother called me this morning," he said finally. "About the cars?" "About everything." He paused. "She said your grandfather would be proud." Lily was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet she got when she was thinking about someone who wasn't here anymore. She'd only known Gerald Ryder for the first 4 years of her life, and most of what she knew of him was secondhand and photographic. But she had his eyebrows, which was a specific kind of continuity that Mason noticed sometimes and couldn't quite bring himself to say out loud. "I think he would be," Lily said simply. Mason nodded and kept driving. Saturday he was back in the garage early, working on the Javelin. He was starting to think seriously about the Ambassador, about what restoring it would actually mean, and whether he should restore it at all, or whether the better move was to leave it in its current state for purposes of documentation and evidence. He'd called Bertolucci about this, and Bertolucci had said the markings were the thing that mattered legally, not the vehicle's condition, and that what Mason did with the car afterward was genuinely his business. His business. He kept coming back to that phrase. The cars were genuinely his business now. Not a dream, not a plan, not a gamble. A business. A real one. With a bank account and a growing reputation and a waiting list that Roy Pittman, who called on Thursday, described as honestly kind of insane for a guy who had 9 pieces of junk 6 weeks ago. "They weren't junk," Mason had said. "I know that now," Roy said. There was something in his voice that was close to an apology without being one directly. Roy wasn't built for direct apology, but the acknowledgement was in there, and Mason heard it and let it be enough. Sunday evening, Mason was locking up the garage when his phone rang. Not Marcus, not Bertolucci, not a number he recognized. He answered. "Mr. Ryder," a woman's voice, older, deliberate. "My name is Helen Marsh. I'm senior partner at Callow, Marsh, and DuPont. We represent Meridian Motor Technologies in the current litigation." A pause. "I'm calling to inform you, as a professional courtesy, that the allegations published Friday regarding our client's contact with you have been formally denied. However, we are aware that you are in possession of documentation of that contact. We would strongly encourage you." "Miss Marsh," Mason said. He was standing in the parking lot of his garage in the Sunday dark, his breath making small clouds in the March cold. "I'm going to stop you there." A brief pause. "I beg your pardon?" "I already forwarded that documentation to Sinclair's legal team. I also kept copies in 3 different places." He paused. "I'm not sure what you were hoping this call would accomplish, but I want to be honest with you about where things stand." The line was quiet for a moment. When Marsh spoke again, the deliberateness in her voice had a different quality, tighter, more careful. "Mr. Ryder, you may be making decisions you don't fully understand the implications of." "I think I understand them," Mason said. "Have a good evening." He hung up and stood in the cold for a while. Then he went home and made dinner and helped Lily with a school project about ecosystems. And after she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and thought about how far this had come from a warehouse in February and a pile of rusted-out cars and a room full of people laughing. He thought about Monday and what Vanessa Sinclair was going to say. He thought about his father's notebook and the word prototype written in pencil in neat small handwriting and the name Bertolucci in the margin and the years of distance between when those words were written and this moment in the kitchen of his house in Kellerton, Michigan. He thought about how things arrive, how the important things almost always come in disguise, broken, burned, covered in rust and bad decisions and other people's laughter, and how the only thing between them and the junk heap is someone willing to look underneath. He went to bed at 11 and was back in the garage by 6. Some things you don't figure out by thinking about them. You figure them out by showing up. Monday morning came gray and cold and ordinary looking, the way the most important days usually do. Mason was on his second coffee when his phone rang. It was Vanessa, not Marcus, not Cole, not the younger attorney whose name Mason had never actually caught. Vanessa Sinclair calling from her personal number at 8:14 on a Monday morning, which told him something about the nature of what she was about to say before she said it. "I've reviewed the proposal with my team," she said. No preamble, no good morning. He was starting to recognize this as her natural register. Not rudeness, exactly, but the communication style of someone who'd spent a decade in rooms where every sentence cost something. The structure is fundable. The 3-year commitment is workable. The instructor requirements are going to take some negotiation on the specifics, but the framework is sound. Mason set down his coffee. "Okay, I want to meet again, not with Cole, not with the full team." A pause that was brief but deliberate. "Just us. This week, if possible." He noticed the "just us." He noticed that she'd said it without qualifying it, without the legal scaffolding that had surrounded everything in their first meeting. "Wednesday works," he said. "Wednesday afternoon. The garage again, if that works for you." "It works." Another pause, slightly longer than the first. "The Meridian situation. The investigation that came out Friday. Cole's team is working with the court on the documentation you sent. It's moving quickly." She paused. "Thank you for that, for forwarding it directly." He hadn't expected her to say thank you. He wasn't sure she had either, from the way it came out. Like it was a word she used carefully, and this time had deployed it before she'd fully decided to. "It was the right thing to do," he said. "Yes." A beat. "It was." She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, looking at the garage wall across from him, the photograph of his father. The tools hung in their order. Then he picked up his coffee and went back to the Javelin. Wednesday arrived the way Wednesdays do. Unremarkably, overcast, threatening rain. Mason spent the morning finishing the Javelin's engine assessment and making 2 calls to parts suppliers about a specific carburetor issue that had no good solution except patience and the right contact in the right region, which he eventually found in a man named Pete in Traverse City, who had a barn full of AMC components that he described with the particular reverence of someone who'd been waiting years for someone else to appreciate them properly. He cleaned up at noon, not extensively, He wasn't performing anything for her benefit this time, but he put the tools back, cleared the workbench of the stuff that had accumulated across the surface the way things do when you're working hard and not paying attention to organization. He made fresh coffee. He pulled a second stool to the workbench area without thinking too much about the geometry of it. She arrived at 2 o'clock, alone, just the blue sedan, parking itself in the gravel lot. She got out carrying nothing. No portfolio, no folder, no briefcase. Just her coat, her hands in her pockets, the same deliberate composure as always. But something about it sat differently today, less constructed. He watched her through the window and noticed that she stood in the lot for a moment before coming to the door, looking up at the building the same way she'd looked at it the first time, but now with recognition instead of assessment. He opened the door before she knocked. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a half-second that stretched a little longer than it should have. "Come in," he said. She stepped inside and immediately went still in the way she had both times before, that involuntary pause that the garage produced in people who knew anything about cars. The Charger was still in the first bay. The Javelin was in the second, hood on now, cleaned up, a different creature than it had been at the start of the week. In the third bay, Mason had moved the two remaining unrestored vehicles, a '68 Olds 442 and the Pontiac GTO Judge Shell he'd been putting off, to make the space less chaotic. And in the corner, still under its green tarp, the Ambassador. Vanessa's eyes went to it, just briefly, just a second, before she looked back at Mason. He handed her the second coffee cup. She took it without comment and sat on the stool near the workbench. He sat on his. The shop lights hummed. Outside, the first tentative sounds of rain began on the roof. "I owe you an apology," she said. He hadn't expected that to be the first thing out of her mouth. He hadn't expected it at all, actually. Not because she wasn't capable of it, but because he'd assumed, based on everything so far, that it would get buried inside the business of the meeting. The proposal, the agreement, the transfer of the vehicle. He'd figured the apology, if it came, would arrive last, as a kind of postscript. Not first, not before anything else. He didn't say it's fine or don't worry about it because those would have been dismissive, and she wasn't saying it for his reassurance. She was saying it because it was a thing that needed saying, and she'd decided to do it properly. "At the auction," he said. "At the auction." She looked at her coffee cup. "What I said about your daughter, I went further than I intended to." She paused. "That's not quite right either. I intended it in the moment, and I shouldn't have. It was a cheap shot at someone I'd made a decision about in about 45 seconds. She looked up at him. "I make fast assessments. It's usually useful. In that case, it was just wrong." Mason looked at her. "What did you assess?" She was quiet for a moment, deciding something. Then, "I saw the truck. I saw the clothes. I heard Roy Pittman call you by your first name in a way that suggested he felt sorry for you. I saw the way you were signing the paperwork, very carefully, like you couldn't afford to make a mistake. And I decided you were someone who was in over their head and was too proud to admit it." She paused. "I've been in rooms my whole career where people underestimated me for the same category of reasons. I should know better than to do it to someone else." He sat with that. It was an honest thing, the kind of honest that cost something to say, and he could tell she knew it cost something because she didn't look away from him while she was saying it. "You weren't entirely wrong," he said finally. "I was in over my head. I just also knew what I was doing." Something happened in her expression that was close to a smile. Not quite, but the muscles were thinking about it. "That's a very precise distinction." It was a very precise situation. She looked around this garage again, slower this time, without the assessment quality. Just looking. Her eyes moved over the photograph of Gerald Ryder and stayed there for a moment. "How long ago did you lose him?" 4 years? Before Lily was old enough to remember much of him. She was 3 when he died. She remembers a few things. The smell of his garage, mostly. The way he talked to engines when he was working. Mason paused. She says he used to apologize to them when he had to take something apart. Vanessa looked at the photograph. "Did he?" "Yeah, he said it was disrespectful to take something to pieces without acknowledging what it was before you started." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father sold used cars, nothing like this. A lot in Indiana, regular cars, nothing special. He wasn't good at it, and he knew it, but it was what he had." She paused. "He died thinking he'd failed at the one thing he'd committed to. I spent about 15 years after that making sure I wouldn't have the same story." She set down her coffee cup on the bench. "She set à quoi?" I'm telling you this because you told me something real, and I'm trying to return the courtesy, not because it's relevant to the agreement. I know, Mason said. The rain on the roof had gotten more serious, settling into the particular rhythm that meant it was going to stay a while. The work lights threw their yellow-white light across the garage floor, and the chrome on the charger caught it and scattered it gently along the wall. The proposal, Vanessa said, shifting, not away from what they'd just said, but forward. I want to talk about the instructor requirement, 2/3 coming from working trades. My team's concern is qualification verification. How do you establish that someone's practical knowledge meets the standard you're describing without an academic credential to point to? You look at their work, Mason said. That's not legally defensible as a hiring standard. Then you build a practical assessment, a skills evaluation designed by people who actually know the craft. You put together a panel, 4 or 5 people, experienced restorers, working mechanics, and they design the test. You score on demonstrated ability, not on paper credentials. He paused. My father used to say you could tell everything you needed to know about a mechanic in 20 minutes with a partially disassembled engine and a set of hand tools. Either they can hear what it needs, or they can't. Vanessa was watching him. That's actually workable, she said, in the tone of someone who'd expected to be pushing back and found unexpectedly solid ground. My HR team will need to be involved in formalizing it. Fine. The 3-year commitment, I want to discuss extending it to 5. She said it carefully, watching for his reaction. Not as a negotiating position. If we're going to do this at all, 3 years isn't enough time to see whether it works. 5 gives the program time to produce an actual outcome we can evaluate. Mason looked at her. 5 is better, he said. I was going to push for 4. Then we're past that. They talked for 2 hours. It was nothing like the first meeting. No attorneys taking notes, no subtext about leverage, no one performing for anyone else. They talked about the program the way 2 people talk when they've each thought carefully about a problem from different angles and are now comparing notes. Vanessa knew things about nonprofit structure and funding mechanisms that Mason didn't, and she laid them out straightforwardly, without the authority posturing. Mason knew things about vocational training and what had failed in programs he'd seen in the region, the ones that looked good on paper and fell apart because the instructors were good teachers but had never actually worked in a shop, or the ones that got kids trained and then couldn't connect them to employment because nobody had built those relationships first. Placement partnerships, Vanessa said, writing something on the back of a business card she'd pulled from her coat pocket. That's the piece your proposal didn't address. If we're training people, we need to know where they're going. Sinclair has 43 dealerships. There are service departments in all of them. That's not a guaranteed path for every graduate, but it's a real one. Mason hadn't thought about that specifically. He sat with it. You'd have to make it a genuine option, not a pipeline that benefits the company, an actual opportunity that the graduate chooses or doesn't. Agreed. She made another note. That's a distinction we can put in writing. He looked at her. You've done this before, set up programs like this. She looked up from the business card. I've funded things, usually with my name on them, which you didn't want, so I'm thinking about it differently. A pause. Honestly, the ones with my name on them they've been fine. They've done what they said they'd do. This feels like something different. She seemed slightly uncomfortable saying that, like she wasn't sure it was an appropriate thing to say in the context of a negotiation, but she said it anyway. Why? He asked. Because you didn't want anything for yourself. She looked at him directly. In my experience, when someone turns down money and asks for something else, it's because the something else is worth more to them than the money. And what you asked for has nothing in it for you personally. No credit, no publicity, no financial gain. She paused. That's either the most genuine thing I've encountered in a professional setting, or it's a long game I haven't figured out yet. It's not a long game, Mason said. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. I don't think it is. The rain had eased into something quieter. They'd both finished their coffee without noticing when. The business card she'd been writing on was almost full on the back now, dense with quick notes, numbers, names, structural details. She looked at it, then at him. I want to see it, she said. The ambassador. Not to assess it. Not for the legal documentation. Cole's team can handle that formally. I just want to see what my father never managed to find in 40 years of being around cars. Mason looked at her for a moment. Then he stood, walked to the corner, and pulled the green tarp back. Vanessa Sinclair got up from her stool and walked to the car and stood in front of it, and she was quiet for a long time, even burned and collapsed and destroyed by time and fire and whatever had happened to it in whatever anonymous storage bay it had sat in for decades. Even with the driver's side caved in and the scorching running the length of the body and the interior reduced to springs and bare metal, it had something. Mason had felt it the first time he'd uncovered it, and he felt it still. Some cars just had it, some quality of presence that survived everything else. His father had believed this about cars, that some of them were built with something extra in them that outlasted the practical decay. And Mason had believed it as a kid, and then stopped believing it as a teenager when beliefs like that seemed childish, and then started believing it again somewhere in his 20s, when he began to understand that his father had been talking about something real. "It's smaller than I imagined," Vanessa said quietly. "The prototype modifications are mostly internal. The exterior was deliberately kept close to standard production specs. They didn't want it to stand out." She walked around the front slowly, stopped at the engine bay. The hood had been carefully removed by Mason weeks ago for examination. She looked into it without touching anything. The cover plate was visible, and even though it looked like a standard repair weld to an untrained eye, she stood there long enough that Mason thought she might actually be seeing it. "Is that it?" "Under the plate," she nodded slowly. "My legal team has the photographs you sent. They have everything." She stepped back from the car and looked at it from a distance, the whole shape of it. "Is it restorable?" "Almost anything is restorable," Mason said. "The question is whether it should be." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means there are cars you restore, because restoring them is what they need. And there are cars that are telling you something in their current state that they'd stop telling you if you fix them up." He looked at the ambassador. "This one sat in a storage unit for maybe 30 years and survived a fire and outlasted everybody who knew what it was. I haven't decided yet whether it wants to be put back together or whether it wants to stay exactly like this and be documented for what it is." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you'd know how to hear the answer to that." It surprised him. Not the statement itself, but the certainty in it, the way she said it like it was just a true thing. He looked at her. She was looking at the ambassador, not at him, and there was something in her face that he hadn't seen there before. A quality of openness that the car had produced in her the way old things sometimes produce it in people. The sense of time compressed, of things that mattered before you arrived. "I'll have the formal agreement drafted by Friday," she said. She pulled the tarp back over the car, doing it carefully, the corners first. It was an automatic gesture, and she didn't seem to notice she'd done it. "I'll have Cole send it to you directly rather than routing through Marcus. You should have your own lawyer look at it." "I will. If there are elements of the program structure you want to modify after you've had time to think about what we discussed today, the placement partnerships, the assessment panel, put it in writing before Friday and I'll incorporate it." "Okay." She put her coat back on, picked up the business card with her notes from the bench and looked at it. Then she held it out to him. "Keep this. It's your copy of what we agreed to today." He took it. Her handwriting was small and compressed and very precise, words running together on the card's small surface in a way that suggested a person who was used to capturing a lot of information in a small space. She moved toward the door. He walked with her, not because it was a performance, but because the garage door was heavy and latched in a way that was annoying from the outside, and it was raining still. She stopped just inside the door and turned to face him. Something was sitting in her expression that hadn't been there when she arrived, something that hadn't been there at the auction, or in the parking lot, or in either of the meetings before this one. It was the thing that appears in people when they've said something true and received something true in return, and the balance of it is different than they expected. "The thing I said at the auction," she said, "about your daughter, I want to say it again more clearly than I did earlier." She looked at him steadily. "That was wrong. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't even honest. It was just mean, and it was aimed at the part of your life that has nothing to do with any of this. That's not the kind of person I want to be." She paused. "I'm not always sure I'm not, but I don't want to be." Mason looked at her. The rain was doing something quiet and persistent behind her on the gravel. "I believe you," he said. It was the right answer and the true one, and she seemed to understand both things. She nodded once, pulled her coat a little tighter, and stepped out into the rain toward the blue sedan. He watched the car back out of the lot and drive down the road toward town, taillights disappearing into the wet gray afternoon, and he stood in the open garage doorway for a moment, feeling the cold and the damp and something else he didn't have an immediate name for. It wasn't victory. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when something that's been misaligned for a long time finally sits right. The satisfaction of a frame rail that's straight again, a bearing that seats correctly, a thing that was wrong finally in its right position. He pulled the door shut and went back to the Javelin. The agreement arrived from Gareth Cole's office on Thursday, one day early. It was 42 pages, which Mason had expected. Legal documents about 5-year programmatic commitments with financial minimums and accountability structures tended to run long. He read all of it, alone at the kitchen table with a pen and a notepad, on Thursday evening after Lily was in bed. He read it slowly, the way he signed his name, the way he walked an auction lot. Not because he was looking for a trap, he'd stopped thinking of it in those terms sometime during Wednesday's conversation, but because the document was about something that mattered and it deserved that attention. He found 3 places where the language needed tightening. One was a clause about instructor qualifications that left a gap Cole's team probably hadn't noticed, which would allow a future administration of the program to use the language in a way that undermined the intent. One was the placement partnership section, which needed an explicit opt-out guarantee for program graduates that wasn't clearly enough stated. The third was a funding minimum that had been written in a way that allowed for inflation adjustments that, read carefully, could reduce the real value of the commitment over 5 years below what they'd agreed to. He wrote his notes clearly and sent them to a lawyer in Detroit that a collector friend had recommended, a woman who did small business and contract work and who, when Mason called her Tuesday after the meeting to explain the situation, had said, "Send me the agreement when you get it," without a lot of additional commentary, which he'd appreciated. She called him Friday morning. "Your 3 notes are all correct," she said. "The instructor clause is the most important one. I would have caught that, but I want you to know you caught it first." A pause. "The other side's attorneys are good. This was either an oversight or a test." "Probably an oversight," Mason said. "The other side's attorney is very thorough, and I think she'd have flagged a test that obvious." "Fair. I'll draft the requested modifications and send them to Cole's office this afternoon." Another pause. "Mr. Ryder, what you've structured here, the program, the terms, this is not what most people would have done with what you had." "I know. I'm not complaining. It's interesting work." She said interesting the way lawyers say it when they mean something stronger. "I'll be in touch." The modifications came back from Cole's office on Friday afternoon, accepted on all 3 points with minor language adjustments that the Detroit lawyer reviewed and approved by phone from her car, which Mason found both efficient and slightly alarming. The signing was scheduled for Monday morning. Sunday was a strange day. Not bad, just strange. The particular texture of a day that exists in the pause between something significant and the formal acknowledgement of it. Mason spent the morning in the garage working on the Olds 442, which was going to be a longer project than most of what he'd tackled so far, because the engine situation was genuinely complicated, and one of the body panels had been replaced with something that wasn't original and would need to be sourced correctly. He didn't mind. Long projects had a rhythm he was comfortable with. Lily was with him in the afternoon doing her homework at the drafting table with the lamp on, occasionally asking him questions about things that had nothing to do with cars and everything to do with the inside of a 7-year-old's processing of the world. At one point, she looked up from her notebook and said, "Dad, do you think the lady knows that you were nice to her?" Mason set down the socket extension he was holding. "What do you mean?" "Like," she thought about how to say it, "when you told her about the other company, the bad one. You didn't have to do that." He looked at his daughter. "How do you know about that?" She looked at him with an expression that was so thoroughly his mother's that it stopped him for a second. "I listen," she said simply. He breathed out. "I hope she knows," he said. "I think she does." "Good." Lily looked back at her homework. "Because I think she's trying." He looked at his daughter for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he picked up the socket extension and kept working. Monday morning, the signing was at a law office in downtown Kellerton, a small firm that Mason's lawyer had suggested as neutral ground, which Cole had accepted. Mason arrived 7 minutes early in the GMC, which made it sound but held together. He wore the same clothes he wore to the auction, not as a statement, just because they were his work clothes, and they were clean, and they were what he had. He thought about wearing something different, and then thought about why he was thinking about it, and stopped. Vanessa arrived 4 minutes after him. She came with Cole and the young attorney, whose name was Nadia, Mason had finally learned from the agreement paperwork, and Marcus, who carried the folder with the original signed copies. They sat at a conference table in a small room. The Kellerton lawyer poured water that no one drank. Cole went through the agreement in summary, hitting the modified clauses and their accepted revisions. Mason's lawyer, who had driven down that morning and was sitting next to Mason in the way that lawyers sit next to clients, alert and contained, nodded at the relevant points. When Cole was done, both sides initialed the modifications in the margins and signed the main signature pages. It took 11 minutes. Cole gathered the papers. Nadia made copies on the office's machine down the hall. Marcus looked at his phone. Mason's lawyer made a note in her own notebook. Mason looked across the table at Vanessa Sinclair, who was looking at the page in front of her. Not quite at her own signature, but near it. The way you look at something you've committed to when the weight of the commitment is real and you're taking a moment with it. She looked up and caught him looking. He thought she might say something formal, something closing statement, something that wrapped it up with a bow. Instead, she said, quietly enough that it was essentially just between the two of them, "I'm going to make sure this works." It was the most direct thing she'd ever said to him. More direct than the apology, more direct than the technical negotiations, more direct than all the careful professional language of the last few weeks. Just, "I'm going to make sure this works." Said the way you say something you're actually going to do, not something you're promising. "I know," he said. They both looked away at the same time, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Outside the law office, on the sidewalk in the weak April sun that had finally broken through the overcast, Mason stood by the GMC and thought about what had just happened. The agreement was real. The program was real. The ambassador would transfer to Sinclair's legal team for evidentiary processing within the week. He'd already signed those papers separately, the prior Friday. And whatever happened in the courtroom would happen without his further involvement. He'd done what he came to do. All of it, from the auction forward, had taken 11 weeks. He had a growing business, a full waiting list, and a bank balance that no longer made him wake up at 3 in the morning doing arithmetic. He had a garage that smelled like his father's garage and had his father's photograph on the wall and ran according to his father's principles. He had a daughter who drew the shape of that garage in her sketchbook and hung around its edges on weekend afternoons, absorbing things without necessarily knowing she was absorbing them, the way kids do when they're in the right environment. He got in the truck and drove back to the garage. Darnell had called that morning about a new vehicle that needed towing. A collector had found a '69 Camaro in a barn 2 counties over, and word had gotten around that Mason was the person to call for that kind of situation. He'd have to look at it first before he committed to anything. He'd learned that much. He pulled into the gravel lot, cut the engine, sat in the truck for a moment in the sudden quiet. The garage sat in front of him, ordinary-looking, cinder block and old signage, and a parking lot that needed gravel attention where the winter had done what winters do. Inside, the Olds 442 was waiting. The Javelin was almost done. There were 2 cars in the back lot under covers that he hadn't started on yet. The phone was ringing more than it used to. And in the corner, under the green tarp, the ambassador. He hadn't told anyone yet what he'd decided to do with it. Not Bertolucci, not Lily, not the Sinclair legal team, who would take what they needed from it for the court and return the vehicle afterward as specified in the agreement. He'd been sitting on the decision for 3 weeks, letting it settle, waiting until it felt finished instead of just decided. It felt finished now. He got out of the truck and went inside. The Sinclair legal team came for the ambassador on a Thursday in late April. They sent 2 people, a forensic documentation specialist named Yuen and a junior attorney Mason hadn't met before, a young man named Terrence who shook hands with the specific firmness of someone who'd been taught to shake hands correctly and was still concentrating on it. They arrived in a white van with equipment cases and spent 4 hours in the garage doing what they needed to do. Photographs, measurements, detailed documentation of the cover plate and the prototype markings beneath it, while Mason worked on the Olds 442 in the next bay and tried not to watch. Ewan was good at his job. Quiet and methodical, He moved around the ambassador with the careful attention of someone who understood that what he was documenting had been waiting a long time to be seen correctly. He asked Mason 2 questions during the 4 hours. The first was whether the cover plate had been disturbed since Mason acquired the vehicle. Mason said no. He'd replaced it exactly as he'd found it after his initial examination. The second question was about the composition notebook, whether Mason still had his father's original notes. Mason went to the drafting table, opened the drawer, and handed the notebook to Ewan without being asked for it. Ewan looked at him. "We'll need to photograph the relevant pages." Mason said, "Go ahead." Terrence, the junior attorney, spent most of the visit standing near the garage door with his hands in his coat pockets, doing the thing young attorneys do at their first significant evidence gathering, absorbing everything without letting on that he'd never done this before. Near the end, while Ewan was packing the equipment, Terrence looked at the charger in the first bay with the uncomplicated admiration of a person who hadn't yet learned to be strategic about what he expressed in professional settings. "That's a 69, Schutz," he said. "It is," Mason said. "Is it for sale?" "Already sold." Terrence nodded, still looking at it. "Did you do all of that yourself?" "Yes." "How long did it take?" 2 weeks for the main work, a few days of detail after. Terrence shook his head slightly, not quite disbelief, more like recalibration. "My uncle had a Charger when I was a kid. Nothing like that. It smelled like old fries and the heat only worked on one side." He paused. He loved that car more than anything. "People do," Mason said. Ewan came back with the cases packed in the notebook. He returned it to Mason with both hands, which was a small gesture that Mason noticed. They loaded the van and left. Mason stood in the doorway and watched them pull out of the lot, the white van turning onto the road and disappearing in the direction of the highway. The ambassador was still in the corner. They documented it, but they hadn't taken it. The agreement specified that physical transfer would occur after the documentation review, pending court approval to introduce it as evidence. That might take another month, maybe more. For now, the green tarp went back on, and the car sat in its corner, and the garage went on being the garage. Mason stood there for a minute after the van left. He was aware of the particular quality of the silence. Not empty, but settled, like a room after a difficult conversation when the right things have finally been said. He went back to the 442. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm, different from the frantic pace of the first 2 months. The restoration business was real now, in a way that was still slightly surprising to him when he thought about it directly. He had a waiting list of 8 vehicles, 2 of which were significant finds that collectors had brought to him specifically because of the Charger's reputation, which had spread in the way things spread in close communities of people who care about the same specific things. He'd hired someone on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a 24-year-old named Caleb from Pontiac, who'd been doing oil changes at a dealership and had reached out after seeing the collector forum photos with a message that said, straightforwardly, "I want to learn how to do what you do. I'll work for whatever you can afford." Mason had called him back, talked to him for 30 minutes, and said, "Come in Tuesday." Caleb was good with his hands and better with his ears. He listened to instructions the way Mason's father had taught Mason to listen, completely, without filling the silence afterward with confirmation that he'd heard. He made mistakes, which was expected, and he took the correction of those mistakes without defensiveness, which was the thing Mason actually cared about. By the 3rd week, Mason trusted him with certain parts of the process unsupervised, which was not something he'd expected to do that quickly. "Your dad taught you," Caleb said one afternoon, not as a question, watching Mason work through a particularly stubborn piece of trim restoration on the Javelin. "You can tell." "What can you tell?" "The way you explain things. You explain them like someone explained them to you the same way. You use the same words every time for the same concept, like the words are specific on purpose." Mason looked at him. Caleb was 24 and not especially prone to this kind of observation out loud, which made it more notable when it came. "He was precise about language," Mason said. "He said if you're vague about what you're doing, you'll be vague about how you're doing it." Caleb thought about this seriously. "That's true," he said, and went back to what he was working on. Mason watched him for a moment. He thought about the program proposal, the instructor assessment panel, the idea of practical knowledge passing from one set of hands to another in the way it had passed to him. He thought about his father at 40 years old in a photograph, holding a coffee cup, squinting at a camera he hadn't expected. He thought about what it meant to teach someone something real. He didn't say any of this to Caleb. He just went back to work. The trial date was in June. Mason followed the public reporting on it the way you follow something that involves you but isn't yours to control. At a distance, with attention but without anxiety, the way you watch weather move across a forecast. The Meridian situation had gotten worse for them in the weeks since the independent investigation opened. 3 separate news articles had detailed the evidence tampering allegations, and a fourth had mentioned, without naming Mason specifically, that a third-party possessor of critical evidence had reported direct financial inducement from a Meridian representative. Daniel Fitch's name appeared in the 4th article. Mason read it once and put the phone down. He called Bertolucci that evening. "You've seen the articles," Bertolucci said. "Yes." "How are you doing with all of it?" Mason thought about the question seriously. "I'm okay," he said. "It's strange to be adjacent to something this big without being inside it." "That's where you wanted to be," Bertolucci said. "You handled it right." "I had good information," Mason said. "I had your information." A pause. "You had your father's information first," Bertolucci said. "I just filled in the gaps." That was true. That had always been true. Everything that had happened, the auction, the ambassador, the agreement, all of it, had started with a composition book in a box in a spare room, read and reread by a son trying to understand what his father had left him. Not money, not property, not a business. Just notebooks. Just the record of a life spent paying attention to things other people overlooked. Mason sat with that for a while after he hung up. Then he went to check on Lily, who was asleep with a book on her face, which was a habit that concerned him slightly and charmed him more than he ever said. He removed the book, turned off the light, and stood in the doorway of her room for a moment in the dark. He thought about what she'd said, weeks ago now, in the truck on the way home from the signing. He'd told her the agreement was done, that everything was settled, and she'd nodded in the way she nodded when information confirmed something she'd already expected. Then she'd said, looking out the window at the road, "Was it worth the scary part?" He'd asked her which scary part. She'd said, "All of it, the money part, the not knowing part." He'd thought about it for a real minute before answering. "Yeah," he'd said. "Yeah, it was." She'd nodded again. "Good, because I was a little scared too, and I want it to have been worth it." He stood in her doorway now and thought about that she'd been scared and hadn't told him, that she'd been carrying her version of the same weight he'd been carrying his, that kids do this. They absorb the anxiety of the people they love, and they hold it quietly so as not to add to the load. He hadn't known she was doing that. He should have known. He filed it away as something to do better. He closed her door gently and went back to the kitchen table and sat in the quiet for a while. The trial started on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of June. Mason did not attend. He'd been asked by Cole's office whether he'd be willing to testify as a fact witness regarding his acquisition and documentation of the ambassador and the subsequent contact from Meridian. He'd agreed and spent a morning at the law office with Cole and Nadia going through what he'd say and how he'd say it, which was essentially exactly what happened, in the order it happened, with no editorial additions. Cole had told him he was a good witness. Mason had taken this to mean that his being a straightforward person who stated facts was, in a courtroom context, an unusual quality. In the end, his testimony wasn't needed. The documentary evidence, the prototype markings, the Meridian communication, the notebooks, the chain of custody from Gerald Ryder's original cataloging through the storage facility to Mason's auction purchase was sufficient. Mason got a call from Nadia on the 3rd day of trial, telling him he could stand down, and he thanked her and went back to the garage. The verdict came 4 weeks later. Sinclair Automotive Group won on all primary counts: the engine design patent, the licensing rights, the damages claim, all of it cleanly decided. The judgment against Meridian was significant enough that 2 separate automotive trade publications ran it as a front-page story, which Mason read about from Bertolucci, who called him the afternoon the verdict came through, sounding like a man who'd set down something heavy he'd been carrying for a long time. "It's done," Bertolucci said. "Yeah," Mason said. "Your father would have—" He stopped, started again. "I've been thinking about Gerald all day. He found that car in a storage facility and he wrote it down in a notebook and he didn't live long enough to do anything about it. And then you—" He stopped again. "Paul." "I know. I'm just saying. The old man's voice had something rough in it. It matters that you finished it. Mason sat on the stool at the drafting table and looked at his father's photograph on the wall. Gerald in his 40s, squinting, holding a coffee cup, standing next to a car he'd brought back from nothing. Ordinary looking. Completely ordinary looking, if you didn't know what you were seeing. It matters, Mason agreed. The Sinclair Automotive Group press team issued a statement about the verdict that mentioned, in the second-to-last paragraph, that the company would be funding a new vocational training initiative for automotive restoration, beginning that fall, in partnership with a technical college in the region. The statement did not mention Mason's name. It did not mention Kellerton. It did not mention the auction or the ambassador or anything that had happened between February and now, which was exactly what he'd asked for. Roy Pittman called him that evening. "I saw the Sinclair press release," he said. "Yeah. The training program, that's yours." Mason didn't say anything. "Mason, that's what you got for it, the program." "That's what I asked for." Roy was quiet for a moment. "You could have taken the money," he said. "She would have paid whatever you asked." "I know. Why didn't you?" Mason thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest but not a lecture, because Roy was a friend, and friends didn't deserve lectures when they asked genuine questions. "Because the money would have been mine," he said finally. "The program is going to belong to a lot of people who don't know it exists yet." Roy was quiet for long enough that Mason checked the phone again. Then Roy said, "Your dad used to say things like that." "I know," Mason said. "I got it from him." They talked for a while about a car Roy had found at an estate sale, a '71 Chevelle that had some questions about its originality that he wanted Mason's opinion on. Mason said, "Bring it by the garage on Saturday." They hung up. The summer moved the way summers do in Michigan when you're busy and the work is good. Too fast, the days long and physical, the nights shorter than they felt. Mason finished the Olds 442 in July and sold it to a collector in Atlanta who flew up specifically to see it and who spent 40 minutes in the garage talking to Mason about the car and about restoration philosophy in general, and who, at the end of the visit, said that he'd been buying collector cars for 20 years and that this was one of 5 restorations he'd ever seen that felt completely honest. Mason didn't know exactly what the man meant by honest, but he thought he understood it, and he said thank you and meant it. The Javelin was finished in August. The first 2 vehicles from the waiting list were in the garage by late July. Caleb was coming in 4 days a week now, instead of 2. And Mason had raised his pay twice in 4 months, which Caleb had not asked for and had responded to both times with a brief nod and a return to whatever he'd been working on, which was the right response. Somewhere in August, Mason allowed a small write-up in a regional automotive magazine. Not an interview. They'd asked for an interview and he'd declined, but a 1-page feature that used his own words from a written statement he'd provided, describing the garage and its work in terms he'd chosen carefully. The piece ran without his photograph, which he'd also stipulated. It included the garage's contact information. The waiting list went from 8 vehicles to 14 in the week after the magazine ran. His mother called. "I read the article," she said. "How did it come across?" "Like you. It came across exactly like you." A pause. "Your father's notebooks are in it." "Just mentioned, not quoted." "I know, I read it." Another pause, the textured kind. He would have been reading that article on his phone and showing it to everyone in the hardware store. Mason laughed, a real one, not performed. He would have read it to them out loud. He would have, his mother said, and he could hear that she was smiling. "Mason, I want to say something." "Okay." "I was scared in February. When you told me what you'd spent the savings on, I didn't say anything because you're a grown man and it was your decision, but I was scared." "I know, Mom." "And I was wrong to doubt you. Not wrong to be scared by... That was reasonable, but wrong to doubt you." She paused. "I want to say that directly." He sat with it. Families accumulated these debts of unsaid things, and when someone decided to pay one directly, it was worth receiving it the same way. "Thank you," he said. "That means something." "Good." Her voice shifted back toward its normal register. "Now tell Lily to call me. I've called her twice this week and she's been busy. She's 7. She doesn't have the capacity to call people back yet." "She absolutely does. She's choosing not to." This was probably true. I'll tell her. The writer restoration program, which is what the training initiative was formally called, with Sinclair's agreement, the name Mason had proposed quietly in a revision to the agreement, and which Vanessa had accepted without comment, accepted its first cohort of 12 students in September. The technical college provided the space. Sinclair provided the funding. The instructor panel had been assembled over the summer by Mason and 2 other working restorers he'd brought in. Bev, the frame specialist from Pontiac, who had agreed to join the panel with the specific condition that she wouldn't be doing administrative work, only technical assessment, which Mason had agreed to immediately, and a man named Tomas from Flint, who had 40 years of bodywork experience and who the panel had identified within 10 minutes of meeting as the clearest technical communicator any of them had encountered. Of the 12 students in the first cohort, 8 had come through vocational referral programs. 3 were in or had recently aged out of foster care. One was a 26-year-old woman named Delphine who had been working as a waitress for 4 years after a college plan fell through and who had written in her application essay, which Mason read 3 times, that she had always understood machines better than she understood most other things, and she didn't know why that wasn't considered a useful kind of intelligence. Mason had flagged her essay to the selection committee without saying anything specific about it, and the committee had selected her in the first round. He didn't attend the program's opening day. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't a program administrator, wasn't an instructor, wasn't on the organizational structure at all. He had deliberately kept his relationship to it at arm's length to preserve the independence he'd written into the agreement. But Tomas texted him that evening, a single message that said, "Good group. They want to learn. You'd like them." Mason read the message sitting in the garage at the drafting table, the work lights on, the evening quiet around him. He wrote back, "Good." Then he put the phone in his pocket and looked at the wall for a while. The photograph of Gerald Ryder. The drawing Lily had made of the garage interior, framed in its slightly crooked frame, because Mason had hung it himself and was better with engine components than with wall mounting. The composition book in the drawer. He thought about what his father's life had actually been. Not the mythology of it, the legend that people had started attaching to it after the auction video circulated and the story grew into something bigger than it was, but the actual life. A man who woke up early and worked with his hands and wrote things down in notebooks and taught people things they hadn't known before and went home at the end of the day to the people he loved. A man who found something important in a storage facility and got sick before he could do anything about it, and so wrote it in a notebook instead, because writing it down was the only thing left he could do. A man who died thinking he hadn't finished. The thing Mason had come to understand over these months was that his father had finished. Not in the way he'd planned to, not the way he'd have chosen, but the work was complete. It had just needed someone else's hands for the last part of it, which wasn't a failure. It was just how some things went. Some restorations took 2 generations. He sat at the drafting table and opened the composition book to a blank page near the back. He picked up the mechanical pencil he kept in the cup on the table, the same brand his father had used, which was not a coincidence, and he thought for a moment about what to write. Not notes on a vehicle, not a technical observation, just something that was true, and that he wanted somewhere concrete, somewhere real. He wrote, "What Dad knew, some things can't be learned from a book. They have to be passed." He looked at it for a moment. Then he added, "Now it's being passed." He closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. Outside, September was doing what September does in Michigan, cooling fast, the nights getting their teeth back, the light changing angle across the gravel lot in ways that made everything look slightly more serious than it had in August. The leaves on the single tree at the edge of the property were starting to think about their next decision. Mason locked up the garage, got in the GMC, and drove home. Lily was at the kitchen table doing homework when he came in. Her backpack exploded across 2 chairs the way it always was, her pencil working on something that looked like a map. She looked up. "You have the finished face," she said. "The what?" "The face where something is done. Not tired. Different." He sat down across from her and looked at what she was drawing. It was a map, but not of anything geographic. It was a map of the garage, detailed, surprisingly accurate in its proportions, with the bays labeled and the drafting table drawn with a tiny rectangle labeled Dad's Book. She'd drawn the ambassador in the corner under its tarp, a lumpy rectangle with a small label that said The Secret Car. "When did you draw this?" he asked. "I've been working on it for a while," she said, returning to her homework. "For the school project about important places. Ms. Tarrant said draw a place that matters to you." He looked at the map. The garage. The bays. The tools on the pegboard, rendered in careful rows. The photograph on the wall, reduced to a tiny rectangle with a stick figure beside a car. Dad's book in the drawer. The secret car in the corner. "Does it still have to be secret?" Lily asked, not looking up. "The car, since everything's done." He thought about that. The ambassador would be returned from the court's evidentiary custody sometime in the fall, per the agreement. What he'd decided to do with it, what had felt finished on the day of the signing and had stayed finished in the months since, was something he hadn't told anyone yet. Not Bertolucci, not his mother, not Roy. "No," he said. "It doesn't have to be secret anymore." She looked up. "What are you going to do with it?" He'd been thinking about this since February, really. Since the first morning he'd pulled the green tarp back and stood in the cold garage light, looking at the burned shell of something that had survived everything thrown at it. Since he'd sat with Bertolucci's words, people have been looking for this a long time, and thought about what it meant that the car had kept surviving the looking. "I'm going to restore it," he said. Lily waited. "And when it's done, I'm going to keep it." She looked at him for a moment. "Not sell it?" "No." "Even though it's worth a lot?" "Even though." She thought about this with the serious deliberation she brought to real questions. "Because of Grandpa Gerald?" "Partly." He paused. "And because some things, the ones that survived the most, the ones that waited the longest, they deserve to end up somewhere that knows what they are. Not a museum, not a collection, just a garage that remembers." Lily looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at her map and added a small detail to the corner where the ambassador was drawn. A tiny star pressed into the paper with the tip of her pencil. "Okay," she said. He got up and made dinner. She finished her homework and set the table without being asked, which was not her default behavior, but happened sometimes in a way that felt like a choice she was making rather than something she'd been reminded about. They ate and talked about her day, which had involved a conflict between two friends that she'd been asked to mediate and had apparently done with a fairness that impressed even herself. "I told them both what they'd done wrong," she said. "Not just one of them." "How did that go?" "They were both mad at me for a minute, and then they were fine." She thought about it. "I think telling the truth to both people at the same time is better than telling just one person what they want to hear." Mason looked at his daughter across the dinner table, this 7-year-old person who was in the process of becoming herself in the way that is terrifying and astonishing in equal measure when you're paying attention to it. "Yeah," he said. "I think that's right." "You do that," she said. "You tell people the truth even when it's not the easy thing." He wasn't sure that was entirely accurate. He had his evasions, his silences, his things he kept close. But he let the statement stand because she was telling him something about what she'd seen, and what she'd seen was worth knowing. After dinner, after dishes, after the homework folder was packed back into the exploded backpack, after Lily was in bed and the house was quiet, Mason sat in the kitchen for a while with nothing in his hands, not his phone, not the notebook, just sitting in the particular quiet of a house where a kid is asleep and the day is done. He thought about Vanessa Sinclair, who he hadn't spoken to since the signing. Her company had fulfilled the first funding installment to the program on schedule, which Tomas had confirmed, and which the technical college administrator had confirmed, and which was, in the end, all that needed confirming. Whether she thought about the garage, or the ambassador, or the conversation about her father's car lot in Indiana, he didn't know. He didn't need to know. What they'd built between them was the program, and the program was running, and that was the shape of what their story had become, and it was the right shape for it. He thought about Bertolucci, who had called twice since the verdict and talked for long stretches about the old days, about the company he'd worked for in the 70s, about the people who'd built the prototype in the first place, engineers in their 30s and 40s who'd had an idea about an engine and had pursued it with the specific belief that useful things deserved to exist. He thought about those engineers, anonymous now, dead probably, their idea persisting in a burned car in a salvage facility for 30 years before anyone found it. He thought about how much existed in the world that was waiting to be found by the right person, how much had been written in notebooks and stored in boxes and left in garages and forgotten in storage units. How much knowledge sat in the hands of people nobody was asking, waiting for someone to show up and pay attention. He thought about Delphine, the woman with the application essay, who understood machines better than she understood most other things, who was somewhere in Kellerton tonight probably thinking about what she'd learned in her first day of the program, holding it the way you hold new knowledge when it's the kind you've been waiting for. He didn't know her yet. He might not ever know her, so I mean, the program was designed to run without him, and that was on purpose. That was the point. But she was out there, and the program was running, and somewhere in the building that the technical college had set aside, there was a half-disassembled engine on a stand waiting for 12 people to come back in the morning and keep working. His father had believed that useful things deserved to exist. He'd spent his whole life acting on that belief without making it a philosophy, or a brand, or a story he told about himself. He just worked. He just showed up. He just wrote things down so they wouldn't be lost. Mason got up, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. In the morning, before Lily was awake, he drove to the garage in the early light. He unlocked the door, flipped on the work lights, and stood in the space that smelled like his father's garage and had his father's photograph on the wall. He walked to the corner. He pulled the green tarp off the Ambassador and folded it carefully and set it on the workbench. The car sat in the work light, burned and broken and completely itself. Everything it had survived written in the damage on its body, every year of waiting present in the rust and the collapsed metal and the scorched paint that had once been some color he hadn't been able to determine yet and would need to research. The engine bay was open, the prototype markings no longer hidden behind their cover plate. The court had returned it with everything intact, as agreed, the plate back in place, the documentation complete. The car was legally his, had been his since February, would be his now in a different, more permanent sense. He put his hand on the roof, on the metal, and felt the cold of it and the texture of the old damage under his palm. He stood there for a minute, just standing there, the way his father had stood next to cars he was about to begin. Then he picked up the composition book from the drafting table and opened it to a fresh page and wrote down everything he could see. The condition of the body, the state of the roof, the damage to the driver's side, the question of the original color, the work the frame would need. He wrote in pencil, small and precise, the way his father had written. He wrote for 20 minutes. When he was done, the page was full. He put the notebook down and picked up the first tool. Outside the garage window, Kellerton was waking up. The first car on the road, the first light in the window of the house across the street, the particular quality of early morning in a place that had been something once and was slowly figuring out what to become next. The single tree at the edge of the parking lot had made its decision about the leaves, and they were going. A crow sat on the fence post, as it sometimes did, watching nothing in particular with great attention. Mason Ryder, 32 years old, single father, restoration mechanic, the man the internet had briefly decided was a symbol of something and who had declined the role, stood in the garage his father would have recognized and began the work that might take him a year, maybe more, maybe less. The work of finding out what was underneath all that damage, of learning what the car had been before everything happened to it. He wasn't doing it for the value. He wasn't doing it for the story. He was doing it because the car had survived long enough to deserve someone's full attention, and he had the attention to give, and the time, and the hands his father had taught. Some things, when you finally get to them, turn out to have been waiting very patiently. The work light hummed, the tools made their sounds. The garage smelled like what it was. He kept going.